At the dawn of the second millennium, the southern lands of Moldavia formed a landscape that was far from static. It was a living system shaped by landforms, rivers, vegetation, and the constant presence of human communities. To understand how societies developed here, it is essential to look at how people interacted with this environment. The terrain, the water systems, and the natural life surrounding them were not just a backdrop, but an active force influencing settlement patterns, survival strategies, and long-term growth. From an early point of view, people did not stand apart from nature. They were deeply connected to it, shaping it while being shaped in return. For centuries, especially up until the 18th century, the physical structure of this region remained largely unchanged. The mountains, valleys, and river networks preserved much of their medieval character. Because of this stability, later written records and maps can still help us reconstruct what the land looked like in earlier times. By carefully comparing these sources, we can build a clear and reliable picture of how the region functioned long before modern transformations began to alter it. In recent decades, however, the relationship between geography and the development of society has often been overlooked. Some scholars have even rejected the idea that the natural environment plays any meaningful role in shaping human history. This skepticism partly emerged as a reaction against earlier theories that exaggerated the power of geography, reducing human development to simple environmental causes. Yet completely dismissing this connection goes too far. While extreme interpretations are flawed, the influence of geography cannot be ignored. The environment does not control human destiny, but it certainly provides both opportunities and limitations that shape the course of societies. It is often believed that as humanity advances, its dependence on nature decreases. But in reality, this dependence never disappears. Instead, it changes form. As societies grow more complex, their needs expand, leading them to seek new resources and develop new ways to use their surroundings. Technological progress allows people to adapt the environment more effectively and to protect themselves from natural disasters. However, this does not mean independence from nature. On the contrary, it reflects a deeper and more intricate relationship with it. When evaluating the role of the natural environment, it is important to avoid extremes. Nature should neither be seen as all-powerful nor as irrelevant. Human activity remains the main driving force behind civilization. Yet the conditions of the land still matter. Fertile soil, access to water, a favorable climate, and natural protection all influence how quickly and successfully a society can develop. A region rich in resources can accelerate growth, while harsh conditions can slow it down or force communities to adapt in creative ways. At the same time, the relationship between humans and nature is not fixed. What once provided advantages can later become a challenge. Fertile lands may encourage comfort and stability, while more difficult environments can push people toward innovation and resilience. Climate also plays a role, influencing daily life and long-term habits. In warmer regions, life may develop at a slower pace, while colder climates demand constant effort for survival. Over time, these conditions can shape not only economic systems, but also ways of thinking and living. Interestingly, the center of human progress has not always remained in the most naturally favorable areas. While early civilizations flourished in warm and fertile regions, later periods saw the rise of societies in more temperate zones. These areas, though less generous in natural resources, encouraged discipline, creativity, and technological advancement. As knowledge and science progressed, people became less dependent on natural advantages and more capable of overcoming environmental limitations. Regions rich in resources have always attracted large populations, but this wealth often came with risks. Prosperous lands drew the attention of neighbouring groups, leading to conflict and invasion. In contrast, less fertile, and more remote areas were often spared such threats, allowing communities there to live in relative stability. This balance between wealth and vulnerability has been a recurring pattern throughout history. The interaction between humans and nature has always been a two-way process. People do not simply adapt to their environment, they also reshape it. Through agriculture, settlement, and resource use, human communities have transformed landscapes over time. In doing so, they have effectively become a part of the natural system itself, influencing the land, water, and living world around them. This ability to modify the environment sets humans apart from other living beings. However, this power comes with responsibility. Disruptions to the natural balance can have lasting consequences. When the environment is damaged, the effects eventually return to impact human life as well. Maintaining harmony between human activity and the natural world is essential for long-term stability. The idea that people must work with nature, rather than against it, has been recognised for centuries, and it remains just as relevant today. In earlier historical periods, especially before the Middle Ages, the relatively low population density and limited technology meant that large-scale environmental damage was rare. Even so, human activity still left its mark. Archaeological evidence shows that at certain times, population levels increased significantly in the Carpathian and Moldavian regions. During these periods, communities expanded agriculture, created fishing systems by controlling rivers, and relied heavily on hunting. These actions gradually altered the landscape, sometimes in ways that nature could not fully repair. By the early Middle Ages, the impact of human activity on the environment had become more noticeable. While not yet overwhelming, these changes hinted at a growing imbalance. As communities continued to expand and exploit natural resources, the delicate equilibrium of the environment began to shift. This marked the beginning of a long process in which human influence would increasingly shape the natural world, setting the stage for the transformations that would follow in later centuries. The land historically inhabited by the Romanians has always stood out as a distinct and recognizable geographical world of its own. Even though it contains mountains, plateaus, hills, river valleys, forests, plains, and coastal zones, all of these features come together in a way that feels balanced rather than fragmented. There is great variety, but there is also a strong sense of order. This is one of the reasons why the unity of the land has so often been linked to the unity of the people who lived upon it. The Romanian space was not simply a random collection of landscapes placed side by side. It formed a coherent natural setting, with its own internal harmony, and that harmony deeply influenced the historical life of its inhabitants. What gives this region its special character is the way its relief is arranged. At the centre lies a broad plateau, encircled by the great arch of the Carpathian Mountains, which rise like a natural wall around the inner lands. Beyond them stretch belts of hills, and farther outward open the wide plains. Seen as a whole, the territory seems to unfold in concentric layers, one landscape leading into another with remarkable proportion. This physical arrangement was not just visually striking. It shaped movement, communication, defense, settlement, and the distribution of resources. The rivers descending from the mountains spread outward like a fan, cutting through the terrain and making passage possible both across and along the land. Vegetation and soils followed this arrangement closely, creating a natural pattern in which forests, grasslands, fertile earth, and waterways combined into a highly interconnected world. This geographic individuality did not isolate the Romanian lands from Europe. On the contrary, the region was deeply connected to wider continental systems. Its mountains formed one section of the great chain that runs through Central and Southeastern Europe. Its plateaus extended into larger Eastern European tablelands. Its plains reach toward the western edge of the Eurasian steppe. In other words, this land gathered together pieces of many larger European environments, without being identical to any of them. That is what made it so distinctive. It was both part of broader natural zones and, at the same time, a space with its own internal unity. The southeastern Carpathian world did not repeat the structure of another European region in full. Instead, it combined several influences into a singular landscape. Moldavia shared this wider Romanian character, while also having its own clear identity. Its terrain descended in ordered stages from west to east, beginning with the high Carpathian ridges, continuing through hills and plateaus, and ending in the lower plains toward the Danube and the Black Sea. This descent was smooth and natural, without abrupt disruption. The soils, plant cover, and climate followed the same pattern. The result was a region whose major environmental features were closely tied to relief. Moldavia was therefore not an isolated exception, but a natural extension of the larger Carpathian Danubian world, shaped by the same broad forces and yet marked by its own particular balance. The climate of southern Moldavia emerged from the interaction of several major forces. Solar radiation, atmospheric circulation, and the physical environment of the land all played their part. Because this region stood at the meeting point of different climatic influences, its weather was marked by contrast and instability. Air masses arriving from the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the northern cold zones, and the deep continental interior all contributed to the shaping of local conditions. Moldavia lay within the temperate zone, yet it also showed clear tendencies toward a more extreme continental climate. Compared with other Romanian regions, it was more exposed. The Carpathians did not shield it fully from cold polar air or from the dry, heated winds that came across the continental steppe in summer and winter alike. At the same time, the mountain barrier often reduced the influence of warmer and more humid currents approaching from the west and south. Along the coast, the Black Sea softened temperatures to a limited degree, but its effect did not reach deeply inland. Because of this exposure, Moldavia often experienced low rainfall and repeated drought. Long dry periods were not rare, and the return of moisture was not always quick or regular. This instability must have had serious consequences for agriculture, settlement, and the rhythm of everyday life. Climate was never a passive background element. It could support prosperity in one generation and create serious difficulties in another. Research on Europe as a whole has shown that the closing centuries of the first millennium and the opening centuries of the second were marked by important fluctuations. Some steppe regions in the south of Eastern Europe moved from moisture to drought. Elsewhere, flood levels rose in major inland basins. North of the Alps, milder winters prevailed for long stretches, though interrupted by colder periods. In Western Europe, dry summers and later cooling trends also reshaped living conditions. It is very likely that the Carpathian Danubian lands experienced many of the same broad climatic tendencies, even if the available evidence does not allow a complete reconstruction in every detail. The rivers of Moldavia formed another fundamental part of its historical geography. All of them ultimately belonged to the basin of the Black Sea. Most of the region's waters flowed into three great river systems: the Siret, the Prut, and the Dniester. The first two reached the Danube, while the last made its own way directly toward the Black Sea. These waterways were not only natural features, but lines of communication, corridors of economic activity, and sometimes barriers as well. Their valleys linked settlements, guided roads, and shaped the movement of peoples and goods. In floodplains and marshy belts, they also created environments rich in vegetation and wildlife. The natural life of Moldavia was equally varied. Its plant and animal world reflected the influence of relief, soil, and climate, producing clear regional differences across the land. Yet among all parts of the environment, the biosphere was the one most visibly transformed by human action. Since the Middle Ages, and especially during the last few centuries, agriculture and animal husbandry altered the original balance of flora and fauna on a large scale. New crops of distant origin were gradually introduced and came to occupy broad areas of land. Plants that had once been unknown in the region eventually became central to daily life and the rural economy. These changes did not merely enrich agriculture, they also remade the visual and ecological character of the countryside. No element of this environment was more important in Romanian history than the forest. In ancient times, forests are believed to have covered a very large share of the land, perhaps well over half of the territory associated with Old Dacia. Historical testimonies and older maps suggest that Moldavia too remained heavily forested until close to the modern period, except for its far southern edge. In the north, west and centre, wooded areas stretched widely across the landscape. River floodplains were also lined with trees which helped reduce the destructive force of seasonal flooding. Roads that connected one important town to another often passed through long belts of beech and other dense forests. Travellers moving along the valleys of the Barlad, the Siret, or the Prut encountered great wooded expanses that shaped both their route and their experience of the land. Up to the beginning of the modern age, forest clearance was still limited in scope, even though legal restrictions were weak or absent. Village communities held many of these lands in common, and peasants expanded farmland by clearing woodland, often using fire as a tool. But beginning especially in the 18th century, deforestation accelerated dramatically. Economic pressure, foreign exploitation, and careless administration all contributed to the destruction of vast wooded zones. Under systems of external control and commercial extraction, the forests of Moldavia were cut down on a scale that ignored long-term consequences. In Bessarabia, after annexation by the Russian Empire, the process became even more severe. Large areas were stripped with little concern for ecological balance or future regeneration. By later centuries, forest cover in many districts had fallen to a fraction of what it once had been. This loss was most dramatic in hilly regions, where woodlands were cleared to create farmland, vineyards, orchards, and pasture. Statistics from the 19th and 20th centuries reveal how fast the process moved. Areas once covered by nearly half forest could be reduced to a fifth or less within decades. In the steppe regions of southern Bessarabia, woodland almost disappeared altogether. The remaining forest was concentrated in more favourable zones, while the open south became nearly treeless. These figures confirm what older written sources and maps strongly suggest. The forests of the past were indeed far more extensive than those of the modern era. Their importance went far beyond timber or local economic use. Forests were one of the greatest protective forces in the history of the Romanian lands. They were a refuge in times of invasion, a shield against raiders, and a place where communities could retreat when open country became unsafe. As fortresses weakened and external threats increased, wooded landscapes often became the safest line of defence. This protective role was especially important during the centuries of repeated incursions from neighbouring powers and nomadic groups. During the troubled era of migrations, the forests likely played a major role in preserving the continuity of the Romanised population in the Carpathian, Danubian space. Earlier interpretations often emphasized retreat into the mountains, but forests in the hills and plains offered richer possibilities for survival. They provided food, cover, shelter, and mobility in a way that high mountains could not. It is therefore more convincing to think not of a people surviving by fleeing upward into barren heights, but by finding protection within the broad forest belts that once covered so much of the land. In southern Moldavia, some of the strongest geographic features appeared at the edges of the region. To the west rose the Carpathian Arch, while to the south and southeast stretched the Danube Delta and the Black Sea coast. Of these, the Carpathians held a particularly powerful meaning. They have often been seen as the backbone of the Romanian world, a massive natural structure around which the life of the land developed. Rising like a great defensive arc before the open steppe, they stood as one of the most prominent landforms between the Urals and Central Europe. Their symbolic and strategic importance was enormous. The eastern branch of the Carpathians consisted of parallel zones running from northwest to southeast. Among them stood a central belt of greater height that marked the line between Moldavia and Transylvania. Yet the mountain world was not made up only of ridges and summits. It also included valleys and depressions that were of great importance for human life. These lower areas offered better conditions for settlement than the harsher heights, and served as natural corridors of communication. In many cases, they also contained clearings created by cutting forest, allowing people to establish pasture and farmland where mountain conditions would otherwise have been too restrictive. Even though the Eastern Carpathians are not among the highest mountains in Europe, crossing them has never been easy. They do not open generously to movement. Unlike some other mountain systems, they lack wide, naturally convenient passages. Their ridges run in parallel lines, their forests historically extended high up their slopes, and their river systems do not provide simple cross-mountain routes in the way some famous valleys do elsewhere. Travel across them could be difficult, slow, and dangerous. Yet these obstacles never fully separated Moldavia from Transylvania. On the contrary, contact between the two sides remained continuous, from prehistoric times onward. Archaeology shows that the same cultures spread across both sides of the mountains over long stretches of time. From the earliest farming communities to later Bronze Age societies and the flourishing of the Dacian world, there was clear continuity of exchange and cultural unity. Materials, tools, ornaments and weapons circulated through the mountain passes, linking inner and outer Carpathian zones. During the Roman period, these connections became even more organised. Routes tied the lands of Dacia to those farther east and southeast, linking military posts, trade centres, and frontier zones. Roads followed river valleys, climbed through passes, and connected the interior of the mountains with the lower Siret and the Black Sea world. These paths remained important long after Roman rule ended. Throughout the age of migrations and the long formation of the Romanian people, the Eastern Carpathians did not function as a final barrier. They were difficult, but they were crossed, used, and known. Among the passes linking southern Moldavia to Transylvania, the Oitus route was one of the most important. In the medieval world, it became a major road for trade, strategy, and political movement. Armies, merchants, and travellers all used it, even though nearly every account described it as hard to cross. Contemporary descriptions portray it as narrow, rocky, steep, and hemmed in by dense forest. In some places it was barely wide enough for a single cart. It required constant maintenance, since rockfalls and fallen trees could quickly make it impassable. Yet its importance was such that rulers, soldiers, and merchants returned to it again and again. The Oitus was not the only crossing. Many other routes pierced the Eastern Carpathians, though most were less favourable and in earlier centuries were little more than paths. Some could be travelled on foot or horseback, and many were used by shepherds moving flocks to high summer pastures. South of the Bistrița, for example, lower mountain zones and open uplands offered more possibilities for movement. Other routes linked the valleys of the Trotuș and the Olt, connecting Moldavia with the lands of the Sheclers and the interior of Transylvania. Some of these crossings later appeared on maps, but they had almost certainly been used long before they were formally recorded. Over centuries, roads shifted, some falling out of use while others gained importance. Yet the principle remained the same. The mountains were crossed in many places, not only by armies and traders, but by shepherds, villagers, and small-scale travellers whose regular movement tied the two sides together. These mountain passages had several roles at once. They enabled exchange between different communities. They allowed goods to circulate from one side of the Carpathians to the other. They offered routes of escape and shelter in dangerous times. They also show that the mountain wall, impressive as it was, never completely divided the populations living around it. The eastern Carpathian branch was a challenge, but not a line of permanent separation. Below the mountains, toward the east, lay the zone often described as the sub-Carpathian country. This was a compact region of higher hills, standing between the mountain belt and the lower hilly lands beyond. In some places it rose clearly above ordinary hill country, though the transition was not always sharp. To the east of this zone stretched the Moldavian Plateau, the largest relief unit in the entire Romanian territory between the Carpathians and the Dniester. Yet even this vast plateau was far from uniform. Its hills, soils, vegetation, and climate varied from one district to another. Northeast of the Dniester, these Moldavian forms continued into the broader plateaus of the Ukrainian lands, connecting the region to the wider geographic world of Eastern Europe. All of this helps explain why Moldavia was such an important historical landscape. It was not a flat or simple land, nor was it an isolated frontier. It was a richly layered environment where mountains, passes, plateaus, forests, rivers, and plains interacted constantly. Its position exposed it to outside influences, but its internal coherence gave it strength. It belonged to a larger Romanian geographic unity, while preserving its own structure and rhythm. For centuries, the people who lived there adapted to drought, used the rivers, crossed the mountains, relied on the forests, and built their lives within a landscape that was at once protective, demanding, and deeply formative. In that sense, Moldavia was never only a setting for history, it was one of the forces that helped create it. The landscape of Moldavia was shaped above all by water. Almost the entire Moldavian plateau was drained by three great river systems: the Siret, the Prut, and the Dniester. Together, these rivers gathered the rainfall, snowmelt, and seasonal runoff of the region and carried it southward or eastward toward the Black Sea. Yet they were far from equal in character. The Siret, though shorter than the Prut, drew much of its strength from tributaries descending from the mountains, which gave it a stronger and more energetic flow. The Prut, by contrast, rose mainly in plateau and plain country and depended more heavily on melting snow and irregular rainfall. Because of that, its waters were generally more modest, rising in spring and early summer and then shrinking noticeably during the rest of the year. Even so, the Prut was long remembered for the good quality of its water, and older observers often spoke of it as a river whose usefulness exceeded what its size alone might suggest. To the east, the Dniester stood apart as a river of exceptional importance. More than a watercourse, it was a frontier carved deeply into the land. For long stretches of history, it marked the edge of worlds. In ancient times, it divided one cultural and political zone from another. In later centuries, it separated Moldavia from steppe powers, neighbouring kingdoms, and expanding empires. Its banks, often steep and rocky, gave it the appearance of a natural wall. In some places, the river ran between stony heights, so striking that chroniclers compared them to sculpted works. Yet for all its imposing appearance, the Dniester was not impossible to cross. There were sections where the water spread more shallowly, allowing passage by carts or horsemen, and such crossing points could suddenly become places of great military importance. In winter, when the river froze, that barrier weakened even further. Ice turned the river from an obstacle into a road, and invading armies as well as traders understood well the opportunities created by severe cold. The rhythm of the Dniester, like that of the other rivers of Moldavia, was deeply seasonal. Spring and summer carried the bulk of its waters, while autumn and winter were quieter. This uneven flow shaped both opportunity and danger. In some stretches, the river could support navigation, especially farther down toward the sea. But elsewhere, shallows, sandbanks, and changing channels made navigation uncertain. That is why reports from the past can seem contradictory. Some travellers praised it as a navigable river, while others dismissed the possibility. In truth, both impressions could be correct, depending on which section they knew. Lower stretches were more favourable to transport, while upper parts could be difficult and unreliable. Even in earlier centuries, rulers and administrators understood that the Dniester had unrealised economic value, and plans were made to improve navigation, though these ambitions often remained limited by technical difficulty and cost. The winter freezing of rivers was not unique to the Dniester. It affected the whole hydrographic network of Moldavia. In hard winters, rivers could be crossed with surprising ease by sledges, riders, and even armies. In milder years, the ice remained weak or formed only briefly. This seasonal change had major consequences for warfare and communication. Enemies sometimes waited deliberately for the rivers to freeze before launching attacks, knowing that water barriers which blocked movement in warmer seasons could suddenly become easy avenues of entry. In this sense, the rivers of Moldavia were never fixed defensive lines. Their power changed with the weather, and human plans changed with them. Beyond the great rivers themselves, the plateau and hilly lands of Moldavia were rich in smaller water bodies. Lakes and ponds were numerous, and older records often speak of their abundance and of the fish they provided. These waters were more than picturesque details in the landscape. They helped regulate the irregular behaviour of the rivers by holding back floodwater, and they added important reserves of food for local communities. In a region where climate could be harsh and rainfall uncertain, such ponds and lakes had practical value far beyond their size. They softened extremes and supported everyday survival. The natural cover of the land reflected this varied environment. In the hilly regions, forests and forest steppe alternated with one another, creating a mixed zone where Central European and Eastern European plant forms overlapped. This balance, however, did not remain untouched. Over the centuries, the expansion of cultivation and the clearing of woodland steadily reduced wild vegetation. As the forests retreated, open steppe conditions spread farther, helped along by the region's tendency toward dryness. Yet this process was not entirely one-directional. In earlier ages, after the end of the great glacial periods, forests had also advanced into lands once dominated by steppe. The boundary between woodland and open grassland was never fixed. It shifted according to climate and human pressure, sometimes slowly and sometimes with great consequence. At the lowest level of the Carpathian Dniestrian landscape lay the plains. These broad lowlands stretched north of the Danube and the Black Sea, bordered by hills, sub-Carpathian country, and the lower reaches of the Dniester. In southern Moldavia, this plain country divided into two major sectors. One was linked to the Romanian plain between the hills and the Prut. The other was the Bujiac plain between the Prut and the Dniester, itself part of the much larger northwestern Pontic steppe. The Moldavian extension of the Romanian plain was a low-lying zone, vulnerable in places to flooding and shaped by its close relation to the Danube. From certain viewpoints, its edges could almost seem like a plateau rising over the river's marshy expanses. The Bujiac plain had a different character. Though not extremely high, it rose gently in some areas and then sloped down toward the sea. It was a land of long ridges, broad undulations, and wide valleys cut at generous intervals across the open country. Some of these valleys ended in elongated depressions that opened toward the Danube or the sea. In earlier times, travellers even described broad sand dunes around the region of Tatatia Alba, showing that wind as well as water helped shape this environment. Later, these sandy stretches were stabilised and cultivated, but they remind us that the Bujiak was once a much harsher and more shifting landscape than the modern eye might expect. At the southern edge of this world lay one of the most remarkable landscapes in Europe, the Danube Delta. This was not an ancient, stable relief form, but a young and still growing creation formed by the combined work of river, sea, wind, and vegetation. Because the delta was constantly changing, it is difficult to reconstruct exactly what it looked like in the early medieval period, let alone in earlier centuries. Year after year, the Danube carried enormous quantities of sediment and deposited them along its banks and at its mouths, slowly pushing the land farther into the sea. Spring floods regularly covered huge areas, leaving only the higher banks above water. Permanent settlement in such an environment was difficult, yet the delta drew people all the same. Its waters were rich in fish, its reed beds and marshes teemed with birds, and its margins offered suitable wintering grounds for flocks. Even when it resisted stable habitation, it offered resources too valuable to ignore. Along the southern border of Moldavia ran the Danube itself, the greatest river route in Europe and the master artery of the entire Romanian hydrographic world. Its lower course was broad, deep, and navigable for large vessels. Merchants, fishermen, and military fleets all used it. Yet navigation was not without danger. Sandbanks and alluvial deposits near the mouths could trap ships, especially those commanded by sailors unfamiliar with the river's shifting behaviour. Such hazards were known from antiquity onward. The Danube was both a highway and a challenge, a river that promised connection but demanded experience and skill. Crossing the lower Danube was rarely easy. Downstream from Silistra, the river widened, broke into branches and spread into lakes, swamps, and marshlands that made passage especially difficult during high water. The floodplain was lined with willows, poplars, reeds, and other dense vegetation, creating an environment that could conceal movement as well as hinder it. Yet in winter, once the water froze solidly enough, this great obstacle could again be overcome. Nomadic peoples from the steppe understood this well, and many incursions into the Balkans took place in the cold season when ice offered a bridge where boats were otherwise necessary. Ancient writers knew that the Danube froze, and medieval observers continued to record winters in which horsemen and carts crossed its frozen surface. When winter was harsh, navigation stopped early, and fleets were forced to retreat before the ice locked them in place. In milder years, however, shipping could continue surprisingly late into the season. This variability made the river a living force rather than a fixed condition. Every decision about transport, war, or commerce had to take into account the behaviour of water and weather. Among the various crossing points of the lower Danube, one of the most important lay near Izasea. This place had strategic value for centuries because it offered one of the best routes between the lands of Bujiak and Dobruja. Armies crossed there, bridges were built there, and strongholds rose there to control the passage. From antiquity through Byzantine, Mongol, and Ottoman times, this crossing remained significant. Whoever commanded it could watch over movement across the lower Danube and influence the balance of power in the surrounding lands. Another important crossing farther west connected Galatsi with the routes leading into Dobruja. These points of passage were not merely practical locations. They were gateways through which traders, pilgrims, diplomats, and conquerors all moved. The lower Danube was also famous for its abundance of fish. Travellers frequently remarked on the richness of its waters and on the low prices at which even prized fish could be obtained. In a world where rivers were roads, frontiers, and food sources all at once, such abundance mattered greatly. It supported local populations and gave additional economic value to an already vital river corridor. Between the Prut and the Dniester stretched another watery landscape, a chain of lakes divided into Danubian and maritime groups. The Danubian lakes were especially valuable for fishing, while the maritime lagoons had less biological richness, but offered other advantages, including the possibility of salt production. When their links with the sea were closed off, thick salt deposits could form, making them economically useful if properly managed. In earlier ages, some of these waters may have had more direct maritime value, but over time, offshore bars separated them from the sea, reducing their significance for navigation. By the medieval period, they were no longer the kind of harbours they may once have been. Geography had altered their function. The plains themselves were largely open country. Trees were rare, and woody vegetation was limited, mostly to shrubs. This lack of forest had important consequences for everyday life. In many places, where firewood was scarce or absent, people had to burn dried mixtures of dung and straw as fuel. The climate made life even harder. Rainfall was limited, summers were hot, evaporation was intense, and drought was a constant threat. Under such conditions, plants often lacked water, and crops could fail if the dry season was especially severe. These were not minor inconveniences, but recurring challenges that shaped the lives of communities year after year. One of the most destructive natural threats in this environment came in the form of migratory locusts. Their breeding grounds lay in some of the low, marshy regions around the Delta and the Prut meadows, and from there they could spread across wide territories. Old accounts repeatedly mention the devastation they caused to crops and pasture. So feared were these invasions that one Moldavian ruler even became known by a name associated with locusts, because such a disaster took place during his reign. Although the surviving reports belong mainly to the late medieval and early modern periods, there is every reason to believe that similar invasions had occurred much earlier as well. Given the broader movements of locust swarms across Eastern and Central Europe, Moldavia can hardly have escaped them. The great river meadows had their own character, distinct from the open steppe. In some places, especially along the Danube, the dense vegetation of marshes and wooded floodplains offered a kind of natural shelter that could be almost as effective as the forests of the hills and mountains. These wet lowlands could provide food, concealment, and refuge. Across the centuries, defeated armies, fleeing peoples, and threatened communities all used these riverine landscapes as places of survival. Marsh and forest together formed a defensive environment in which enemies could lose their advantage and those who knew the land could endure. In the Middle Ages, the broad plain of southern Moldavia still retained much of the appearance it had in antiquity. Ancient geographers described the territory between the Black Sea, the Danube, and the Dniester as a deserted land of the Gaetae, flat and poor in water. Later travellers echoed similar impressions. They saw a steppe-like world with very few settlements, long empty stretches, sparse wells, and scattered shelters of shepherds. The word desert, however, must not be misunderstood in the modern sense. This was not a lifeless wasteland. It was a wide grassland with low population density, few permanent settlements, and a landscape dominated by mobility rather than urban concentration. Shepherds passed through it, flocks grazed upon it, and nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples recognized it as suitable country. This plain was not an isolated zone. It opened directly onto the vast Eurasian steppe, which stretched thousands of kilometers eastward into the heart of Asia. Though the lowlands north of the Danube were not identical in every detail to the great eastern steppes, they shared many essential features with them in relief, climate, vegetation, and soils. This continuity helps explain why ancient writers linked the region with the Scythian world, why medieval sources called it the steppe of the Cumans and Kipchaks, and why later generations described it as the Tatar steppe or the wild plain. To travellers crossing it, the impression was often the same: immense grasslands, very few trees, scarce settlements, and a way of life centred on herds, mobility, and adaptation to open country. Descriptions left by medieval and early modern observers capture this landscape vividly. They speak of endless grassy expanses, of no forests, no mountains, scarcely any stone, and of people who depended on wagons to cross the open ground. Fuel came not from wood but from dried dung. Houses and villages were sparse. Springs and wells were precious. In many areas, animal husbandry dominated because the pasture was excellent, even where more settled agricultural life remained thin and scattered. Such descriptions were not exaggerations. They reflected the reality of a frontier environment that was rich in grazing potential but poor in the dense network of towns and forests familiar in other parts of Europe. The Bujaic marked not the end but the continuation of this world. The steppe did not stop there. It narrowed westward, passed between the Prut and the Siret, and then extended farther along the Danubian basin. Even south of the Danube, into Dobruja, important steppe characteristics remained visible in climate, vegetation, and seasonal rhythms. This helps explain why pastoral nomads from the North Pontic lands were repeatedly drawn toward Dobruja. To them, it must have seemed like a familiar environment, one that resembled the open lands from which they came. Because of this continuity, the entire zone between Inner Asia and the lower Danube became a great corridor for the movement of mounted pastoral peoples. Time after time, migrations and invasions followed this route from east to west. Sometimes these movements were driven by drought, extreme cold, or other environmental crises that damaged herds and made survival difficult in the deeper steppe. At other times, they were driven by ambition, warfare, or the pressure of stronger tribes, pushing weaker ones ahead of them. Whatever the immediate cause, the geography of the steppe made such movement possible on a vast scale. Finally, beyond rivers, marshes, and plains lay the waters of the Black Sea itself. Moldavia's coast, between the mouths of the Danube and the Dniester, was not long, but it was significant. In this sector, the sea was less salty than in many other areas because of the immense quantities of fresh water poured into it by the great rivers. Ancient sailors noticed this difference, and some even speculated about its effects on the colour and nature of the sea. The shoreline, though relatively narrow, linked Moldavia to broader maritime networks and reminded all who approached it that this land stood at the meeting point of river worlds, steppe worlds, and the sea. The Black Sea along Moldavia's coast was never a world apart from the land beside it. Its waters were deeply affected by the climate of the neighbouring continent, and that meant the sea itself changed sharply with the seasons. Unlike warmer seas that preserve heat more steadily, the surface waters here responded quickly to winter cold and summer warmth. In especially severe winters, the sea could even freeze near the shore, sometimes stretching far out from land. Such events were uncommon enough to leave a strong impression on those who witnessed them. Ancient and medieval observers treated them as extraordinary signs of nature's harshness. For people living along this coast, the sea was not always a softening influence. At times it became another hard and dangerous extension of the winter landscape. The movement of the Black Sea's waters was also crucial to life and travel. Along the northwestern coast, the surface current generally flowed from north to south, pushed mainly by winds coming from the continent and strengthened at times by the outflow of the great rivers. Part of this water then passed through the Bosporus, toward the Sea of Marmara and the Mediterranean, while another part followed the coast of Asia Minor before splitting again in different directions. For sailors, these currents mattered enormously. To move with them meant easier travel, less effort, and shorter voyages. To struggle against them was another matter entirely. In earlier centuries, those setting out from the mouths of the Danube often had to wait for favourable winds before attempting a southbound journey. The sea offered speed compared with overland travel, but only when wind, current, and season allowed it. That maritime route could save a great deal of time. A journey that required many weeks on land could be reduced to little more than a week by ship under favourable conditions. This made the Black Sea an important artery of communication linking distant courts, ports, and trading centres. Yet its dangers were never far away. In stormy weather, navigation became a gamble with death. Winter brought the greatest risk. Violent winds and heavy waves could smash vessels, delay fleets, and force travellers to remain in port for months. The northwestern Black Sea gained a reputation far beyond its own shores as a difficult and often hostile body of water. The fear inspired by its storms was known not only in the lands around it, but even in the eastern Mediterranean and the Islamic world. Sailors respected it because it could turn suddenly from a route of opportunity into a field of disaster. During the cold season, bad weather regularly interrupted navigation. Harbours and anchorages became places of waiting, uncertainty, and forced delay. Travellers sometimes remained trapped for months, unable to move north or south until conditions improved. Even powerful maritime peoples knew the limits imposed by winter seas. Ships might continue to sail, locally or on short routes, but the broader pattern was clear. Winter narrowed the possibilities of movement. This was not unique to the Black Sea. Across much of the medieval world, cold weather navigation was often restricted, whether by official rules or by common sense born of bitter experience. Better ships gradually improved these possibilities, but storms still destroyed the careless and punished those who ignored the sea's seasonal rhythm. The coastline between the mouths of the Dniester and the Danube was not well suited for great harbours. It was mostly straight, edged with sandbanks, shallow waters, and lagoons separated from the open sea. These features made large-scale port development difficult. In that sense, nature placed limits on what this coast could become. Still, not every stretch was equally unfavourable. The Dniester estuary offered somewhat better conditions, though, even there, the constant build-up of silt demanded attention. For that reason, the area around the mouth of the Dniester rose to special importance. There, a significant harbour centre developed in antiquity and continued to matter through later Greek, Roman, Genoese, Moldavian, and Ottoman periods. The success of such places depended not on an ideal coast, but on adaptation to a difficult one. Taken together, the southern part of the East Carpathian world formed a remarkably rich and varied geographic setting. The land, despite its contrasts, could support strong and durable forms of human life. Many travellers and observers who crossed Moldavia in the medieval and early modern periods were struck by its fertility, its wide pastures, its crops, and the abundance of livestock. Some descriptions went so far in their praise that they bordered on exaggeration, presenting the country as a place lacking nothing useful to man. Others were more measured, but still described Moldavia as beautifully proportioned, pleasing, and generously endowed by nature. Even if not every enthusiastic remark should be accepted literally, there is no doubt that the region earned a reputation across Europe as a productive land, especially in agriculture and animal breeding. Yet this abundance was not spread evenly across the whole of southern Moldavia. Some areas were more fertile than others, and not every landscape was equally suited to settled cultivation. The mountain zones near the Carpathians were rougher and less favourable for farming, though they were often excellent for grazing. These higher lands demanded hard labour, local experience, and deep knowledge of the environment in order to be used successfully. Even in later times, the population density of the mountain zone remained lower than that of the plains and lower hills. At the other extreme, the open lowlands also remained thinly populated for long periods. Not because they were useless, but because they were difficult in another way. Exposure, drought, insecurity, and the particular demands of steppe life all limited dense, permanent settlement. As a result, the human geography of Moldavia developed unevenly, shaped by the opportunities and restraints of each zone. In terms of soil fertility and the raising of plants and animals, the Carpathian Dnestrian area held a favoured position. But the same could not be said about underground wealth. The region was not rich in the kinds of mineral resources that often transform economies. Oil, natural gas, and coal existed in some zones, especially near the Carpathian depressions and the sub-Carpathian belt. But in earlier centuries, they had no practical economic value. Only salt stood out as truly vital. Salt was essential to life, food preservation, and exchange, and its importance far outweighed that of resources that later ages would find more valuable. At the same time, the eastern Carpathian lands were generally poor in iron and non-ferrous ores. This shortage mattered greatly. It meant that many crafts in Moldavia depended on imported raw materials or finished products from neighbouring regions, especially Transylvania. Local production existed, but it often had to rely on resources coming from outside. This reality also helps explain why old stories about hidden mountains full of gold and silver should not be taken seriously. If such riches had truly existed in exploitable form, they would almost certainly have been used, not deliberately concealed. In a land where imported materials were so important, valuable local ores would have been an enormous advantage. The absence of such wealth shaped economic possibilities and tied Moldavia more closely to exchange networks beyond its own borders. Even though Moldavia belonged to the temperate zone and enjoyed a climate that was relatively balanced compared with more extreme regions, it was never free from natural disturbances. Long before human activity began to alter the environment on a large scale, nature itself could inflict serious damage. Droughts and floods were among the most dangerous calamities, and communities with limited technical means could do very little to resist them. Severe frosts, hailstorms, and earthquakes added to the danger. In some years, these disturbances encouraged the spread of insects such as locusts and tree-damaging beetles, or of rodents that threatened crops and food stores. When such events came together, they could devastate entire communities. Harvests failed, flocks were destroyed, homes were ruined, and human lives were lost. The results were famine, disease, impoverishment, malnutrition, and sometimes migration. These disasters became even more destructive when they coincided with war. A land already weakened by drought or flood could be pushed into catastrophe by invasion, raiding, or military requisition. In such moments, natural hardship and human violence fed one another, multiplying suffering. This was not a rare pattern in the historical life of Moldavia. Environmental crisis and political crisis often overlapped, and together they left deep marks on settlement, economy, and social stability. Because the environment varied so much across the region, human communities did not spread evenly or develop in identical ways. Some zones favoured dense settlement and cultivation. Others encouraged pastoral life, seasonal movement, or looser occupation. Over time, these patterns changed. Local populations learned how to use the land according to its possibilities, while intruding peoples, migrants, and conquerors also took advantage of what the environment offered. Geography did not dictate one single historical outcome. but it created a field of possibilities that shaped the actions of everyone who entered it. The strategic significance of southern Moldavia remained great throughout history. Its location at the western edge of the Eurasian steppe made it a natural corridor for nomadic peoples moving toward the Balkans and the lower Danube. Time and again, mounted groups followed this route westward, using the open plains as a pathway. At the same time, the region offered access to the northwestern shores of the Black Sea, to the Danube, and to the Danube Delta, all of which increased its value in trade, warfare, and communication. It was therefore both a frontier and a crossroads, exposed to outside pressures, yet also linked to wider worlds by river and sea. And still, Moldavia was never simply an open passage, vulnerable from every direction. Its attachment to the Carpathian Arc gave it a different kind of strength. The mountains did not isolate it completely, but they offered protection, depth, and resilience. They formed a durable line of resistance against outside force, while also preserving hidden routes of contact with other Romanian lands beyond the ridges. In this way, Moldavia's geography combined openness and shelter, risk and stability. It could be crossed, invaded, and contested, but it could also endure. That balance helps explain why the region remained so important over the centuries. Southern Moldavia stood at one of the most exposed crossroads in Eastern Europe. It lay where the western edge of the Eurasian steppe met the lower Danube lands, close to the northern approach to the Balkans. Because of that position, it became a natural corridor for migration, invasion, and military movement. When nomadic peoples reached the grasslands of Bujiac and Baragan, they usually continued in one of two directions. Some pushed toward the Balkan Peninsula, while others followed the Danube westward. Not every migrating group passed directly through Moldavia, since some preferred to move toward the Pannonian Plain through the northern Carpathian passes. But the general pattern remained clear. The pressure came from east to west, and only when campaigns failed did these steppe peoples fall back toward the Black Sea lands they had come from. During the first millennium, few European regions were as deeply affected by this movement of peoples as southern Moldavia. Once the Danube stopped functioning as the northern frontier of the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century, the lands north of the river no longer occupied the same place in the immediate political priorities of Constantinople. Even so, Byzantium did not lose interest in the wider northern zone. The empire continued to watch the steppe, lands beyond the Black Sea, and it remained particularly concerned with the Danube Delta. Its rulers relied on naval strength and careful diplomacy, trying, whenever possible, to influence the military energy of the northern peoples, rather than confronting every danger directly. Even when Byzantine control was incomplete or indirect, the empire never entirely stopped looking northward. By the later centuries of the first millennium, the political rhythm of Eastern Europe changed in a major way. A slowdown in the violent movement of peoples began to appear, and one of the main reasons was the rise of the Khazar state. North of the Caspian, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea, the Khazars became one of the great powers of the region. Their alliance with Byzantium, strengthened through earlier struggles against Persians and Arabs, remained important for a long time. From the Byzantine point of view, Khazaria was far more than a distant ally. It was a barrier that helped prevent steppe nomads from pouring unchecked toward Byzantine borders. In that role, the Khazar state was highly effective. For a prolonged period, it created stability across the southern steppe zone of Eastern Europe. The importance of the Khazars went even further. They also played a decisive role in stopping Arab expansion through the Caucasus into Eastern Europe. In that sense, their success had enormous consequences. Without this northern barrier, the balance between the Christian and Islamic worlds might have shifted much more dramatically. Even so, the influence of the Islamic world still entered Eastern Europe through culture, trade, and religion. Some communities converted to Islam, and commercial links with the Muslim world became increasingly important. Khazaria itself, however, did not become either a Christian or an Islamic state. Though exposed to both missionary pressure and political influence, its ruling elite chose Judaism instead. That choice gave the Khazar state a very distinctive place in medieval Eurasia. Khazar power extended westward as far as the Dnieper. Some peoples lived under direct Khazar rule, while others paid tribute and retained a limited autonomy. The archaeological culture associated with this large, mixed, and multi-religious world spread over a huge area between the Volga and the Dnieper. What mattered most for Moldavia and the neighbouring lands was the effect this political system had on the freedom of movement of nomadic groups. The Khazar state sharply restricted the uncontrolled movement of steppe peoples. It also acted as a filter along the lower Volga, blocking or slowing groups that tried to pass westward. Because of this, historians sometimes describe the period as a Khazar peace, a long era in which relative order replaced the chaos of repeated invasions. North of the Black Sea and near the mouths of the Danube, the consequences were clear. After the movement of the Bulgars under Asparuk, no similarly large invasion struck the area for a considerable time. The local populations of the Carpathian Danubian lands benefited greatly from this calmer environment. Population growth followed, especially during the period associated with the Dridu cultural horizon, when the lower Danube plain experienced steady demographic expansion. Areas such as Bujiak and Baragan, which had previously been vulnerable to disruption, now saw more stable occupation. The same broad conditions may also help explain why some Slavic groups moved farther into the Black Sea steppe zone. But this balance did not last forever. In the 9th century, the Khazar world began to face serious pressures. Some of these were internal. Within the Khazar Confederation, centrifugal movements appeared, including the rebellion of the Kabars. After that revolt was crushed, some of the Kabars escaped and joined the Hungarians. Religion has often been suggested as one reason for the split, since the Khazar elite had adopted Judaism, but that explanation alone is not fully convincing, especially given the religious tolerance known to exist within the Khazar state. More likely, political and tribal tensions played a stronger role. What matters is that the internal cohesion of the Khazar system was weakening. At the same time, new external pressures were rising. From beyond the Urals, nomadic movements from Central Asia became more active again. Meanwhile, farther west, a new political force was emerging in the middle Dnieper basin, the Kievan Principality, built through the combined energies of Varangian adventurers and Slavic populations. These two developments, steppe pressure from the east and state formation on the Dnieper, had direct consequences for the lands east of the Carpathians as well. Among the most important new players were the Pechenegs. In the steppe north of the Caspian, the Khazars fought them, and at one stage managed to defeat them with the help of the Uzes. Some eastern sources even distinguish between Pecheneg groups under Khazar authority and others beyond it, but this cooperation did not last. Soon the Khazars and the Uzes became enemies, and the Khazar state continued to weaken. The Pechenegs likely contributed to that weakening too. By the second half of the 10th century, as the Rus struck devastating blows against the Khazars, the Pechenegs had inserted themselves between Byzantium and the Khazar world and were increasingly seen as allies or useful partners of Kiev. The older order in the steppe was collapsing, and a new balance of power was taking shape. At the same time, another great force was reshaping Eastern Europe, the Scandinavian expansion. In the west, Vikings from Norway and Denmark raided the coasts of Britain, France and Spain and pushed as far as North America. In the east, the Scandinavians of Sweden followed a different path. These Varangians moved along the river routes of Eastern Europe, combining warfare, trade, and political ambition. They travelled on the two great axes that linked the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Baltic to the Caspian. In cooperation with Arab merchants and with the participation of many other peoples, they helped create one of the most active trade networks of the age. The effects of these exchanges reached even the Carpathian Dniestrian lands, where finds of Arabic coins show how wide the economic network had become. The contacts between the Varangians, the Eastern Slavs, and Byzantium were especially intense. Economic need first opened the route from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But later, political and military motives strengthened it further. This was the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks, a river-based artery that linked northern forests and lakes with Constantinople. Boats could move from the Baltic into the interior, then be dragged over short portages from one river system to another until finally reaching the Dnieper and the Black Sea. From there, sailors followed the western coast southward toward Byzantium. Along this journey, they passed the mouths of the Dniester and the Danube, and they almost certainly came into contact with the populations living east of the Carpathians. There is even evidence of such contact preserved in a striking form. A memorial rune stone on Gotland records that a man named Rodfos was killed abroad by Vlachs, a term used for Romanians. The inscription does not specify the exact place, but it was most likely somewhere east of the Carpathians. This is one of the earliest known written references to Romanians outside the mountain arc. It offers a brief but vivid glimpse of a world in which Scandinavian travellers and local populations met, traded, fought, and crossed paths along the great eastern routes. The Scandinavian advance into Eastern Europe was made easier by divisions among the Slavic tribes. Varangian leaders managed to impose control over major centres, and from these bases they founded political structures that would grow rapidly. According to the Old Rus Chronicle, Scandinavian rulers established themselves at Novgorod and Kiev, and compelled several Slavic and Finnic groups to pay tribute. In the 9th century, forces from Kiev even attacked Constantinople by sea. Though that first major assault failed, it signalled the arrival of a new northern power. Within a relatively short time, however, the Scandinavian ruling class in Rus became assimilated by the surrounding Slavic world, much as other Viking settlers became absorbed in Normandy and southern Italy. As the rulers of Kiev expanded, conquering neighbouring Slavic groups and pulling them away from Khazar influence, the authority of the Kievan state grew. By the early 10th century, the political balance in Eastern Europe had clearly shifted. The Khazar state was weakening. The Pechenegs were becoming more powerful. Kievan Rus was rising fast. These changes did not remain confined to distant steppe politics. They directly affected the Romanian lands beyond the Carpathians. In the lower Danube region, however, the military and political situation was shaped by more than just these new eastern powers. Older rivalries remained strong. Byzantium and the Bulgarian state both sought influence in the area. Ever since the Bulgars settled south of the Danube, the empire had clashed with them over control of this strategic frontier. Even when Byzantine power had receded, the emperors never abandoned the goal of restoring influence over the Danube Delta and the surrounding region. Their naval strength in the Black Sea remained one of the tools they hoped to use in pursuit of that aim. During the reign of Krum, Bulgarian success in the Balkans reached a dramatic peak. The defeat and death of the Byzantine emperor in battle became legendary, and the war did not end there. Soon afterward, Adrianople fell to the Bulgars, and many of its inhabitants were deported north of the Danube. Such forced resettlement was a common medieval practice. Human communities were valuable resources, and states moved them deliberately for strategic, economic, or defensive reasons. The exact location where the people of Adrianople were settled is uncertain. Some scholars place them in Bujiac, others in the Romanian plain. Both possibilities remain open. What is clear is that these deportations reveal Bulgarian ambitions north of the Danube and the ability of the Bulgarian rulers to impose authority beyond the river itself. Bulgarian inscriptions from the same period point in the same direction. They mention campaigns that reached far into territories north of the Danube, extending as far as the Dnieper and the Tisa. The exact goals of these expeditions are not always clear, but they show that the Bulgarian state was not content to remain only a Balkan power. It looked northward as well, pushing into regions that also mattered to nomads, Khazars, and later to Hungarians and Rus. Southern Moldavia stood in the middle of these overlapping ambitions. That is what made this region so important and so vulnerable at the same time. Southern Moldavia was not simply crossed by migrations. It was drawn into the struggle between empires, steppe confederations, rising principalities, and regional powers. Khazars, Pechenegs, Varangians, Bulgars, and Byzantines all shaped its history, whether through direct occupation, military passage, trade, diplomacy, or the broader changes they brought to the political map of Eastern Europe. After the death of Omurtag, the political balance that had once favoured the Bulgars began to break apart. In the year 837, the people who had earlier been deported from Adrianople saw their chance to return home. With the support of the Byzantine fleet, they tried to escape north of the Danube and make their way back to Thrace. The Bulgars attempted to stop them. A commander crossed the river to intercept them, but he was defeated. A second force also failed, likely because Byzantine ships blocked its movement and controlled the crossing points. The Bulgars then turned to the Hungarian horsemen living north of the Black Sea and asked for their help. Even they could not prevent the return. The deported population managed to reach the ships and sail away. This episode says a great deal about the changing realities of power at the lower Danube. It suggests that the Bulgars no longer maintained a strong and permanent military presence in the plain north of the river. Their influence there may still have existed in theory, but on the ground it had clearly weakened. Farther to the northwest, the Bulgars had enjoyed greater success for a time, in lands connected to the old Avar world, especially in territories left exposed after the collapse of Avar power under Frankish pressure. Some historians have also argued that Transylvania fell under Bulgarian control. This idea is often linked to reports that salt trade toward Moravia could be influenced by Bulgar action. Since the great salt resources lay in Transylvania, the conclusion has been drawn that Bulgaria must have ruled that region directly. But this is not the only explanation. Control over salt routes did not necessarily mean control over the mines themselves. It may simply reflect Bulgar authority over transport corridors farther west, especially in the Tisa zone, where trade could be blocked or redirected. By the time the Hungarians entered Transylvania, there is no convincing sign that a firm Bulgarian political structure still existed there. The archaeological evidence used to support the idea of widespread Bulgarian rule beyond the Danube is also far less certain than it may first appear. Material culture on both sides of the river often shows similar features, but similarity does not always mean political domination. It can just as easily point to influence, trade, shared practices, or broader regional contact. For that reason, objects and settlement patterns alone do not prove that Bulgaria ruled Transylvania or the whole of the outer Carpathian world. If there were organised political structures in those regions before the arrival of the Hungarians, they seem more likely to have been local formations, some perhaps connected with Bulgaria, others independent of it. What matters most is that the Romanian communities of the area were clearly not politically primitive. Long before the rise of the later medieval principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, there were already signs of advanced organization. Strongholds defended by moats, embankments, and timber barriers show that local society had military experience, planning, and the ability to defend itself. Bulgar influence north of the Danube was real, but it did not extend everywhere with the same strength or permanence. The situation in Wallachia and Moldavia was different from that in the Tisza lands. There is good reason to believe that southern Moldavia did at one point fall under Bulgarian authority. A Byzantine emperor, writing in the 10th century, described the Pechenegs as occupying lands that had once belonged to Bulgaria. In the middle of the 10th century, such territory can only have lain north of the Danube. That evidence makes it difficult to dismiss Bulgarian rule on the left bank of the lower river altogether. Yet it is just as misleading to imagine that 9th century Bulgaria stretched across all Romanian lands beyond the Carpathians. Some historians once drew that map far too broadly, placing almost the whole of Moldavia, Wallachia, Banat, Maramuresh, and large parts of Transylvania within the Bulgar sphere. Such a view overstates Bulgarian expansion and turns influence into direct possession. The same caution applies to the earthworks that cross parts of the outer Carpathian lands. Long lines of dikes and embankments in southern Bessarabia, central Bessarabia, and Wallachia have sometimes been interpreted as frontier defences of the first Bulgarian state. That remains possible in some cases, but the evidence is not secure. Some of these earthworks may go back to Roman times. Others were never properly investigated and cannot yet be dated with certainty. Because of this, they cannot be used as simple proof of a vast and clearly marked Bulgar frontier. Similar problems appear in theories that the North Danubian lands were widely settled by a Slavo-Bulgarian population, and that the Dniester formed a sharp ethnic boundary between them and the Eastern Slavs. Such ideas rely too heavily on vague written notices, on contested interpretations of the Dridu culture, and on place names recorded much later. None of that is enough to reconstruct a firm ethnic border for the late first millennium. By around the year 900, the region near the mouths of the Danube was becoming the scene of a new and complicated crisis. Several conflicts overlapped at once. The Byzantine Empire and Bulgaria were once again at odds. At the same time, the steppe world north of the Black Sea was in motion as the Pechenegs and the Hungarians struggled against one another. To this was added the growing aggression of Kievan Rus in the Dniester region, where control of Black Sea trade routes was becoming increasingly valuable. Southern Moldavia lay directly in the path of all these changes. After the reign of Boris, a ruler remembered above all for the Christianization of Bulgaria, the country entered a new period of military ambition under Tsar Simeon. Though educated in Constantinople and trained in both classical and theological learning, Simeon ruled as a warrior king. Soon after taking power, he entered into conflict with Byzantium. These wars came at a time when the empire was already under pressure elsewhere, especially from the Arabs, and Byzantine diplomacy searched urgently for allies. In that moment, the empire reached northward to the Hungarians. Byzantine envoys and ships were sent to the Danube to negotiate their support, offering gifts and hostages according to the diplomatic customs of the age. That meeting itself is revealing. The fact that Byzantine agents found the Hungarians at the Danube around 895 shows that southern Moldavia was no longer under effective Bulgarian control, not even in a symbolic sense. The zone near the Danube Delta was in Hungarian hands, though those same Hungarians were under intense pressure from the east, where the Pechenegs were advancing against them. Their presence on the lower Danube at the end of the 9th century is also supported by other traditions, which suggest that their movement into this region was not a brief raid, but part of a broader westward shift already underway. Medieval Eastern sources preserve traces of how this Hungarian world was imagined geographically. Some describe the lands of the Hungarians as lying between great rivers. Later interpretations often tried to identify these rivers with the Danube and the Don, but the matter is more complex. In many Eastern writings, the name often connected to one of these rivers usually refers to the Volga, not the Don. That makes it difficult to believe that the Hungarians controlled a zone stretching all the way from the Volga to the Danube. What seems more likely is that, before their final move into the middle Danube basin, the Hungarians and their Kabar allies occupied a broad territory in the western part of the Pontic steppe, a land remembered in their traditions as a country between rivers. By the mid-10th century, that same region was already associated with the Pechenegs. It was described as a land organized around the basins of 5 important rivers, generally identified as the Dnieper, the Southbug, the Dniester, the Prut, and the Siret. This detail is important because it places the eastern Romanian lands directly inside the wider steppe zone contested by successive nomadic peoples. The Hungarians had been there before the Pechenegs, and the Pechenegs after them. Southern Moldavia was therefore not a distant margin of these changes. It was one of their central theatres. Some modern explanations have also pointed to environmental pressure as one of the reasons for these migrations. Research on long-term climate patterns in Eastern Europe suggests that there were alternating wet and dry periods affecting forests, steppes, river basins, and inland seas. At certain times, the Caspian rose and flooded neighbouring lands, while the western steppe suffered from drought. This combination could damage both agriculture and pastoral life. In the 9th and 10th centuries, such instability may have contributed to the weakening of Khazaria and to the westward movement of steppe peoples like the Hungarians, Pechenegs, and Uzis. Drought did not create these migrations by itself, but it likely made them more urgent and destructive. Once the Byzantines concluded their agreement with the Hungarians, the imperial fleet helped them cross the Danube. Bulgarian river defences were removed, and Hungarian forces struck Bulgaria hard. Simeon now found himself in a dangerous position. Yet this is where his political skill became clear. He acted with patience and calculation. He negotiated for the release of Bulgarian prisoners and at the same time opened peace talks with Emperor Leo. By doing so, he bought himself precious time. Then he turned to the Pechenegs and made an alliance with them against the Hungarians. Together, Bulgars and Pechenegs attacked the Hungarian settlements, while many of the best Hungarian warriors were away on campaign. That blow changed the course of Central European history. Faced with destruction in their eastern homeland and threatened from multiple directions, the Hungarians abandoned the steppe lands they had occupied and moved into the middle Danube plain. This was not simply an improvised retreat, it was the decisive migration that ensured their survival as a people, and laid the foundation for their future kingdom. The conflict with the Pechenegs should not be seen only as the result of Simeon's diplomacy. The confrontation had deeper roots. The Pechenegs themselves had been driven westward by earlier pressures from the Uzis and other steppe powers. In this way, a classic chain reaction unfolded across the Eurasian steppe. One people displaced another, and that people in turn displaced the next. Even though written sources suggest that the western edge of Hungarian power before 896 reached the Danube and perhaps the Siret basin, archaeology does not clearly confirm a strong Hungarian presence along these rivers. Certain objects found in the Carpathian Dnestrian area resemble items known from Hungarian contexts. Among them are distinctive pendants and ceramic kettles whose parallels are common in the Hungarian world of the 10th and 11th centuries. These finds may reflect contact, exchange, or cultural influence between local communities and steppe peoples. But they do not prove that Hungarians settled permanently at those sites. Such items were also used by other Eastern and Central European populations, and their presence alone cannot define ethnicity. The same caution is necessary with burials. A number of graves found in Moldavia, Wallachia, and nearby areas have at times been identified as Hungarian. Yet most of these attributions remain uncertain or incorrect. Some belong to local cemeteries. Others fit much better with Pecheneg or Cuman burial customs than with known Hungarian graves from the Pannonian Plain. Only in a very small number of cases could a grave possibly belong either to Hungarians or to another steppe group, and even then the evidence is incomplete. For now, there is no firmly proven burial assemblage north of the Danube Delta that can be securely linked to the 9th century Hungarian migration. That does not mean such evidence will never appear. It only means that the case has not yet been demonstrated. What does emerge clearly, however, is the broader picture. The late 9th century was not a time of collapse for the local communities of the eastern Romanian lands. On the contrary, the Dridu communities of the Romanian plain and the Bugeac seem to have experienced prosperity. There are no clear traces of widespread destruction that could be tied to Hungarian raids. That suggests that, although steppe powers moved through the region and influenced it, local society remained resilient and continued to develop. Seen as a whole, this was a turning point in the history of southern Moldavia and the wider, lower Danube world. Bulgarian power north of the Danube was fading. Byzantine diplomacy was still active and capable of shaping events. The Hungarians were passing through a decisive stage of migration. The Pechenegs were entering the region as a new steppe force, and the local Romanian communities were neither absent nor passive. They were already organised, defended and present within a political landscape far more complex than older national narratives once allowed. At the current stage of research, there is still no solid proof that the Hungarians maintained a permanent settlement west of the Dniester. That does not mean they never entered those lands. Raiding parties could certainly have crossed them, especially during campaigns, such as the attack encouraged by the Byzantines against Bulgaria in 895. But if we look at the broader picture, several signs suggest that the lower Danube region was not, in those years, the real centre of Hungarian political interest. Their attention was directed much more towards Central Europe. Repeated expeditions in that direction likely convinced them that the West offered greater long-term possibilities. Remaining in the steppe, lands left them exposed to Pecheneg pressure from the east, while the Balkans were effectively blocked by the still powerful Bulgarian state. In that situation, the attraction of a new homeland farther west must have grown stronger. The written record reflects this orientation clearly. Hungarian forces appeared in the eastern regions of the Carolingian world as early as the 9th century, and in the years that followed, they struck around Vienna, Moravia, and Pannonia. Their Khmer allies also took part in some of these movements, sometimes following routes different from those of the main Hungarian groups. Contemporary chroniclers described these raids with horror, portraying them as devastating invasions that killed, captured, and terrorized local populations. Whether or not every accusation in those accounts should be taken literally, the message is unmistakable. At the end of the 9th century, the momentum of Hungarian expansion was increasingly directed toward Central Europe, not toward a stable occupation of the lower Danube plain. Old Hungarian and East Slavic traditions also point in the same direction. They describe the Hungarian tribes passing by Kiev on their way toward the lands that would become their new home. Another important account places the decisive clash between the Hungarians and the Pechenegs near the mouth of the Don. That detail is significant because it suggests that the core of Hungarian settlement, before their final migration, lay not in Moldavia, but much farther east, in the lower Dnieper region and in the lands west of the Don. Their most active horsemen may well have reached the mouths of the Danube during military actions. But that is very different from saying that their permanent centre of life was in Moldavia. For that reason, the old idea that a part of the Hungarian population remained behind in Moldavia after 896 and later became the ancestors of the Changos has no serious scholarly foundation. Historical and linguistic research points in another direction entirely. The Changos arrived in Moldavia centuries later, crossing from eastern Transylvania over the eastern slopes of the Carpathians. Their settlements were concentrated mainly between the mountains and the Siret, not in the eastern steppe zone that had once belonged to the Hungarian sphere before the move into Pannonia. Their impact on local place names and river names reflects this later and more western pattern of settlement. The route taken by the Hungarians into the Pannonian plain also tells us much. The most likely path was through the Vereki Pass in the northern Carpathians, one of the great corridors linking the East European plain with the middle Danube basin. This was a route used by other major movements as well, including the Mongols centuries later. It was known, practical, and strategically sound. By following it, the Hungarians passed through the territories of the future Galician lands and avoided Moldavia altogether. Neither written evidence nor archaeological material points convincingly to a large Hungarian migration through the eastern Carpathians or through the Danube Iron Gates, despite occasional attempts to argue otherwise. Even the best pass between southern Moldavia and Transylvania, the Oitus route, was difficult enough in the Middle Ages and would have been even less suitable in the late 9th century, especially for a mass migration involving carts, herds, and families. There is one later tradition that seems to place the Hungarians for a time in Transylvania before their entry into Pannonia, but that account is doubtful. It appears to reflect later courtly storytelling more than reliable memory. Earlier traditions do not support it, and the historical evidence suggests that Hungarian penetration into Transylvania happened gradually from west to east, only after the conquest of Pannonia. The same is true of the Seklers, who are often linked in origin with the Kabars. They too seem to have reached eastern Transylvania from the west, not by crossing Moldavia first. This matters because it fits a larger historical pattern. Transylvania was not taken in one sudden leap from the east, but entered step by step as Hungarian rule expanded eastward over time. This whole process becomes especially important because it is in connection with these conflicts in Pannonia and Transylvania that the first written mentions of the Romanians, north of the Danube, appear. Two completely separate sources, one East Slavic and one Hungarian, both state that when the Hungarians arrived they encountered Vlachs and Slavs. These notices have long been the focus of bitter historical controversy, especially among those who denied the continuity of the Romanized population north of the Danube. Some tried to argue that the word used for Vlachs did not refer to Romanians at all, but to Franks, Italians, or some other people. Others claimed that medieval chroniclers had mistakenly projected the realities of their own time back into the 9th and 10th centuries. But such explanations become increasingly hard to sustain when examined closely. Modern study of the great Hungarian narrative source has shown that, although it contains some anachronisms, much of its material rests on genuine traditions and historical realities. In several cases, names that seem confusing at first make better sense once one recognizes that medieval authors sometimes use familiar labels in a broad way. For example, the word later associated with Cumans could also be used in a wider sense for Turkic Nomads in general, including earlier groups. Once that is understood, the presence of such terms in the text is no longer evidence of pure invention. Yet while some scholars have accepted that the chronicler was not entirely wrong about these nomadic peoples, they remained reluctant to admit that he may also have been right about the Vlachs. The resistance is often rooted less in the text itself than in older assumptions about when and how the Romanians could have appeared north of the Danube. Another medieval Hungarian chronicler later added that after helping to conquer the Pannonian plain, the Shecklers received territories in the mountains near lands belonging to the Vlachs. He even suggested that the Seculars may have adopted their writing system from them. Whatever one makes of that detail, the passage again shows that the Vlachs were seen as an established population in the region, not as a newly arrived or obscure group. Those who reject the continuity of the Romanized population have usually argued that Romanian-speaking groups crossed north of the Danube only much later, perhaps from the 11th century onward, and especially between the 12th and 14th centuries. According to that interpretation, they gradually filtered into the Hungarian kingdom, either directly or by a detour through lands outside the Carpathian Arc. But this theory faces a serious problem. If such a migration on a large scale had really been taking place during the very centuries when Hungarian chroniclers were writing, it is hard to believe that court historians would have ignored it completely. These men lived close to the centres of political information. If the Vlachs of Transylvania had only recently come from the Balkans, the event should have been visible in both memory and administration. Instead, the sources treat them as an already existing population. Even more telling is the direction of movement found in other medieval texts. Byzantine evidence from the 11th century speaks of Vlachs in the Balkans who, after conflict with imperial authority, moved southward, not northward. A Western author from the beginning of the 14th century also refers to Vlach shepherds moving from Pannonia toward the Balkans after the arrival of the Hungarians. This does not mean that no Romanian-speaking groups ever crossed the Danube from south to north. Such local crossings surely happened, as they always had along a great river frontier. Linguistic evidence also shows continuing contact between Romance-speaking populations on both sides. But these smaller movements are very different from the claim that the entire Romanian element north of the Danube was planted there late by migration. At most, such crossings could have reinforced an already existing population. In the effort to avoid recognizing the early presence of Romanians, some scholars even proposed more extreme ideas. One of the strangest was the theory that the names used in medieval sources did not refer to Romanians at all, but to an obscure Turkic group from the Ural region. According to that view, the people called Blasi or Blacki in the sources were supposedly descendants of a tribe that had once moved west with the Bulgars. But this interpretation collapses under the weight of its own implausibility. There is no narrative or archaeological evidence for such a migration. There is no convincing explanation for how such a small group could have preserved its identity for centuries, while living among powerful neighbouring peoples. And there is no way to reconcile that theory with the medieval tradition that explicitly described the Vlachs as connected with the Romans. That last point is crucial. In one important source, the Vlachs in Pannonia are remembered as the shepherds of the Romans. The phrase is extremely revealing. It shows that medieval tradition itself associated them with a Roman origin. No amount of speculation about distant Turkic tribes can explain why such a memory would attach to them if they had really been a small people from the Ural world. The idea is historically and linguistically untenable. It belongs to the long line of imaginative but unsupported theories that tried to remove the Romanians from the early history of the Carpathian Danubian space. There are also a few Eastern references that may preserve early echoes of lands associated with the Vlachs, north of the Danube. One Armenian geographical tradition mentions a country called Balak, near the lands of the Sarmatians and Bulgaria, which would place it somewhere north of the Danube. But this passage appears to be a later insertion into an older work, probably made in the first centuries of the second millennium, rather than in the time of the original author. That means it cannot be used as a secure witness for the 9th century, even though it remains interesting as a sign that Armenian writers knew of such a people or country at a relatively early date. A similar problem appears in Turkic narrative traditions. Some later versions of the Oguz legend include references that historians have linked to Romanians. Yet these passages cannot be pushed back into the 9th century with confidence. The context better fits a later period, especially the time when Cumans entered into lasting contact with the Romanian lands in the late 11th and 12th centuries. Here again, the material is suggestive but not firm enough for the very early date some once wanted. When all of this is brought together, the broader picture becomes much clearer. There is no convincing evidence that the Hungarians established a durable presence west of the Dniester before their move into Pannonia. Their main settlements lay farther east, and their final migration followed the northern Carpathian route, rather than passing through Moldavia. The later Hungarian conquest of Transylvania advanced step by step from the west. By the time these processes began, local Romanian and Slavic populations were already present in the regions that the newcomers encountered. There are also a few Eastern sources that may preserve early references to the Romanians, although they have not attracted as much attention as they deserve. Among them, 2 Arabic writers of the 10th century stand out. One of them listed the peoples living near the Turks and named, among others, the Khazars, the Russians, the Slavs, the Walaj, the Alans, and the Greeks. He also noted that the Walaj and the Alans were fewer in number than the Slavs and the Russians. The exact form of the name is distorted, but many scholars believe it points to the Romanians. That interpretation makes sense because the group is placed in the company of peoples clearly belonging to Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Another Arab author, writing a great catalogue of books and peoples, mentioned the Bulgars, the Khazars, the Alans, and a people whose name appears in a form that may also refer to the Romanians. The distance between these writers and the Carpathian Balkan world explains why the names are imperfect. But even through that distortion, they may preserve an important memory: that the Romanians were already known in the Eastern world as one of the peoples living in the lands north of the lower Danube and around the Black Sea. At the same time, written and archaeological evidence shows that in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Romanians of the Dniester region lived alongside Slavic tribal groups, especially the Tivertsians and the Croatians. The Tivertsians appear in the Old East Slavic Chronicle as a people who had once occupied lands closer to the Black Sea and later spread toward the Danube and the Dniester. The chroniclers remembered them as numerous and strong enough to possess fortified centres, whose traces were still visible when the text was composed. Later, manuscript versions differ in detail, but when the written evidence is compared with archaeology, the broader movement becomes clear. These communities gradually shifted westward, settling between the South Bug and the Dniester. Their world was not empty frontier land. It was organised, defended, and deeply involved in the changing political life of Eastern Europe. The Tivertsians are especially interesting because some medieval writers attach to them a word that has often been understood to mean interpreters or translators. That detail has led many historians to think that they were bilingual. The most convincing explanation is not that they knew Greek, which would make little sense in this context, but that they lived beside another people whose language they had learned. In this case, the most likely neighbours were the Romanians. If so, then this small detail suggests something very important: that there were already Romanian-speaking communities near the middle Dniester, well established enough for their Slavic neighbours to become familiar with their language. Archaeology strengthens this picture. Between the Dniester and the Rhôte, and along the middle course of the Dniester, excavations have uncovered fortified settlements, open villages, and cemeteries dating from the 9th to the 11th centuries. Some of these sites were protected by earthen ramparts, deep ditches, and wooden palisades. Their material culture includes tools, weapons, jewellery, and Arabic silver coins, showing that they belonged to a wider network of exchange and conflict. The cremation burials found in some of these cemeteries fit well with what is known of the Slavic world in Eastern Europe at the time. Everything about these finds suggests that the Tivertsians formed a strong Slavic presence in this region, living in close proximity to local Romanian communities. As the power of Kiev expanded in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, these Slavic groups were drawn into its orbit. The rulers of Kiev gradually imposed their influence over more and more tribes, and the Tivertsians appear among those who eventually accompanied the Rus on campaigns against Byzantium. That tells us that by the early 10th century they had come under Kievan influence, whether by force or through alliance. Yet the situation was never simple. Not every tribe submitted in the same way, and not every alliance was born of defeat. In a world threatened by steppe nomads, joining the Rus could also mean seeking protection against stronger enemies. The neighbouring Eurasians followed a somewhat different path. They resisted Kievan pressure for longer and were only subdued after a hard struggle. Older scholars once tried to place their main centre in Bessarabia, but later research has shown that this was mistaken. Their political heart lay much farther east, closer to the Dnieper. Even so, the confusion itself reveals something important about the region. The lands between the Bug, the Dniester, and the Prut were part of a frontier world in which tribal movement, shifting influence, and uncertain borders were all normal. No single power held the entire region securely, and the spaces between the big rivers often remained only loosely controlled. To the north, in the upper basins of the Dniester and the Prut, the Romanians and the Tivertsians had other Slavic neighbours, the Croatians. These too appear in the East Slavic chronicles, and seem to have fallen for a time under Kievan influence. Archaeological finds from their area include fortified sites and cremation cemeteries similar to those known elsewhere in the Slavic world. In northern Moldavia, some fortified centres resemble those from the Croatian zone so closely that they point to strong links across the region. Once again, this was not a silent or isolated landscape. It was a frontier full of contact, movement, and overlapping spheres of influence. Meanwhile, the rulers of Kiev were not content with dominating nearby tribes. During the 10th century, they launched major expeditions along the Volga, the Caspian, and especially the Black Sea. Some of their most famous campaigns were directed against Byzantium. Their fleets and warbands used the Great River route that led from the north through the Dnieper and out into the Black Sea. Then followed the western coast southward toward Constantinople. Along that journey they passed the mouths of the Dniester and the Danube, and they almost certainly landed on the shores of Moldavia and Dobruja. The lower Danube and the northwestern Black Sea were therefore not distant from the great events of the age. They lay directly on one of the most important military and commercial routes of medieval Eastern Europe. But by the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the success of that route depended on a new and formidable power, the Pechenegs. After being driven westward from the Volga region, they took over the steppe lands north of the Black Sea and replaced the Hungarians there. This gave them control over the open spaces through which armies, traders, and messengers had to move. Once they settled in this region, no one could safely use the Dnieper road to the Black Sea without reckoning with them. The stretch around the Dnieper rapids was especially dangerous, since boats had to be dragged overland there and were exposed to attack. Whoever controlled the steppe around that choke point could make or break the communication between Kiev and Byzantium. As Pecheneg power expanded westward, the lower Danube and southern Moldavia were drawn more deeply into the politics of the steppe. These nomads did not simply occupy grasslands and wait. They raided, negotiated, allied themselves with stronger powers, and moved across huge distances with great speed. Their pressure was felt not only in the open plains, but even beyond the Carpathians. One source suggests that the Pechenegs attacked the Transylvanian Principality of Jalu, weakening him at the very moment when he also faced Hungarian pressure. Another account implies that a different local ruler, Glad, may actually have drawn steppe allies into his own struggle. In medieval narrative tradition, those allies were called Cumans, but the term was likely being used loosely for Turkic nomads, and may in fact refer to the Pechenegs. Whether attacking or assisting, the Pechenegs were already deeply involved in the politics of the Romanian lands. Byzantium understood this very well. For the emperors in Constantinople, the Pechenegs were both a danger and an opportunity. They might raid Byzantine lands, but they could also be bribed, flattered, or turned against other enemies. Before the Great Byzantine-Bulgarian War of 917, both sides tried to win their support. Simeon of Bulgaria sent envoys and sought to secure their help, even through marriage diplomacy. The Byzantine court answered with gifts and counter-negotiation, and for a moment it seemed possible that the nomads would enter the war on the imperial side. In the end, however, the cooperation failed. The Byzantines were left without the steppe support they had hoped for, and Simeon won a crushing victory. Still, the whole episode shows how important the Pechenegs had become. They were no longer an outside threat alone. They were now players whose decisions could affect the balance of power between empires. The Byzantine court did not give up on this strategy. Even after the disaster of 917, it continued to seek alliances with the peoples beyond the Danube and the Black Sea. Hungarians, Alans, Pechenegs, Russians, and other steppe groups were all drawn into the diplomatic calculations of Constantinople. Subsidies, gifts, and promises were used to divide enemies and redirect violence. The empire understood that survival did not depend only on armies. It also depended on controlling relationships across the frontier. In the decades that followed, the Pechenegs continued their movement westward. This gave them easier access to the plain of southern Moldavia and to the Danube crossings. By the mid-10th century, they were already taking part in larger campaigns involving Bulgarians and Hungarians against Byzantium. This is the earliest certain evidence that they had crossed the Danube in force. Once that step had been taken, southern Moldavia became even more clearly part of their zone of movement. The plains there offered an ideal passage, open and broad enough for mounted nomads to cross quickly on their way toward the Balkans. In 944, for example, Igor of Kiev moved through southern Moldavia as he advanced toward Byzantium. His force was not made up of Rus alone. It included Slavic contingents, Varangians, and Pecheneg allies. Their plan was to join naval forces near the mouths of the Danube and continue southward toward Constantinople. Once again, diplomacy intervened. The emperor sent gold and rich gifts, and the campaign was abandoned before it reached the capital. Before turning back, however, Igor urged the Pechenegs to strike at Bulgaria. Whether they did so immediately is uncertain, but what is certain is that the lower Danube corridor had become one of the key roads linking the steppe, Kiev, Bulgaria, and Byzantium. One of the most valuable windows into this world comes from the Byzantine emperor, Constantine Porphyrogenitus. His political handbook for his son contains some of the most precise information preserved from the age about the peoples north of the Black Sea and around the lower Danube. It was written not as a history for its own sake, but as advice for rule. It explains how to handle neighbouring peoples, how to divide enemies, how to buy allies, and how to use one force against another. That makes it especially revealing. It shows a Byzantine Empire that still dreamed in large strategic terms, even at a time when its military strength was no longer what it had once been. Constantinople sought to secure the Black Sea, protect Crimea, maintain trade, and preserve influence through a combination of diplomacy, subsidies, intelligence, and selective intervention. For the history of the Romanian lands, this matters enormously. It means that the lower Danube and the Moldavian frontier were not marginal zones, forgotten by the great powers. They were watched, negotiated over, crossed by armies, and woven into the diplomatic systems of empires and nomads alike. Romanians in this region lived among Tivertsians and Croatians, beside trade routes used by Rus and Varangians, under the shadow of steppe, confederations like the Pechenegs, and within the strategic horizon of Byzantium itself. The peace made between Byzantium and Kievan Rus in the mid-10th century was not simply a diplomatic pause. It was born from fear. Constantinople understood the danger of a larger coalition forming against it, one that might unite the Rus, the Pechenegs, and the Bulgarians. Such an alliance could have placed enormous pressure on the empire from the north. It was likely because of this fear that the Byzantines also tried to approach the Hungarians and turn them against the Pechenegs. But the memory of the disaster the Hungarians had once suffered in the steppe lands was still too fresh. They had no desire to be drawn again into that same struggle, and so Byzantine efforts in that direction failed. The clearest picture of the Pecheneg world north of the lower Danube comes from Byzantine writing. By the middle of the 10th century, the Pechenegs had taken over the lands once occupied by the Hungarians, the broad region between the great rivers of the steppe. In the west, their power reached as far as the Dniester, the Prut, and the Siret. Byzantine descriptions make it plain that their territory stretched from the lands facing the Danube frontier all the way east, toward the Don. Other travellers and geographers from the same century confirm the same reality. They placed the Pechenegs directly north of Bulgaria and north of the Byzantine Empire. Even Byzantine dictionaries from later generations repeated the idea in a striking way, saying that the lands once known as Dacia were now associated with the Pechenegs. That statement did not mean the ancient Dacians had somehow become nomads. It meant that the Pechenegs had imposed political control over territories that had once belonged to the old Dacian world and were still inhabited by Romanized populations. Western observers also became aware of this situation. A Hebrew historical work written in southern Italy noted that Hungarians, Bulgarians, and Pechenegs all lived around the Danube. A Lombard bishop familiar with Byzantine politics described Constantinople as surrounded in the north by fierce peoples such as Hungarians, Pechenegs, Khazars, Rus, and Bulgarians. These remarks show that the Pechenegs were no longer seen as distant tribes, somewhere deep in the steppe. They had become a force directly tied to the lower Danube and to the frontier of the empire itself. By this time, their control had extended across the plain lands of Wallachia and southern Moldavia. Their repeated attacks into the Balkans from the 930s onward prove that they were already established in the lands north of the river well before Byzantine scholars began writing about them in detail. Yet their arrival did not wipe out the settled population. The local communities of the Dridu world continued to exist even after the middle of the 10th century. Archaeology shows this clearly. Settlements of the native agricultural population continued side by side with Pecheneg burials, and in some local villages objects of nomadic origin have been found as well. That means the nomads and the locals did not live in completely separate worlds. There was conflict, certainly, but also contact, tribute, coexistence, and perhaps exchange. The Pechenegs had no real need to destroy all the settled communities of the lower Danube plain. They controlled a huge zone of steppe north of the Black Sea and did not depend entirely on the narrow grasslands between the Bujak and the Baragan. Those western areas were useful for pasture, but they were also dotted with farming communities whose fields would have had to be turned into grazing land if the nomads wanted to replace them completely. That would have required effort and constant supervision. Since the population density in the region was not high, the simpler solution was to dominate the land politically, demand tribute, and move through it when needed. For mounted raiders pushing toward the Balkans or beyond the Carpathians, the local Romanian communities were not an obstacle large enough to justify total destruction. In that sense, the Pechenegs imposed power over the region without erasing the older population that lived there. In the east, however, the Pecheneg advance had harsher effects on some of the Slavic, fortified communities between the Dniester and the Rut. During the second half of the 10th century, their attacks seem to have intensified, and by the 11th century, several strongholds in that zone were violently destroyed. Some of the people living there may have fled northward into safer lands. These fortified settlements were likely targeted, precisely because they served as centres of resistance. A scattered village was less dangerous to the nomads than a defended hill fort. The destruction of such places reveals how fragile the frontier could become when steppe power pressed hard against it. While all this was unfolding north of the Danube, Byzantium itself was changing. Under the Macedonian dynasty, especially in the later 10th century, the empire entered a period of renewed strength. Trade revived, cities recovered, the army and navy became more effective, and imperial confidence returned. Strong rulers and brilliant generals transformed the empire from a defensive state into an offensive one. Emperors such as Nicephorus Phocas and John Tzimiskes pushed eastward against the Arab world and also turned attention once again to the Balkans. At the same time, Bulgaria, under the long reign of Peter, was weakening. This shift in power gave Byzantium new opportunities at the lower Danube. When conflict with Bulgaria broke out again, the Byzantines made a fateful choice. Hoping to weaken Bulgaria without overcommitting their own forces, they invited Sviatoslav of Kiev into the struggle. At first, this may have seemed like a clever use of frontier politics, the old Byzantine method of turning one barbarian power against another. But it quickly became clear that Sviatoslav had his own ambitions. After crossing the Danube and defeating the Bulgarians, he no longer behaved like a useful ally. He began acting as a conqueror in his own right. His campaigns were interrupted when the Pechenegs attacked Kiev, perhaps encouraged by Byzantine diplomacy. After dealing with that danger, he returned south again, convinced that the lower Danube offered him a richer and more promising centre of power. His ambitions, however, were ultimately broken by the Byzantines. John Tzimiskes led a remarkable campaign, one of the great military achievements of the empire. Byzantine forces retook fortress after fortress, and finally trapped Sviatoslav at Dristra. After a long siege by land and river, the prince was forced to abandon his claims south of the Danube. The result was historic. For the first time in roughly 3 centuries, Byzantine authority returned to this northern frontier zone in a serious and organised way. On his way home, Sviatoslav was ambushed and killed by the Pechenegs near the Dnieper Rapids. Their shifting behaviour toward Kiev, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, depended entirely on what advantage they could gain at the moment. This Byzantine victory also mattered greatly for the lands north of the Danube. Once the empire reappeared on the southern bank in strength, the Romanian communities across the river gained a direct and powerful neighbour. That opened new possibilities for trade, religious influence, and political contact with the Balkans. Greek sources even mention that some fortresses north of the river sent envoys to the emperor and asked for his protection. Whether all of these can be identified securely is uncertain, but the report itself is telling. It shows that the peoples north of the Danube were not passive spectators. They were watching events closely and were willing to negotiate with the empire when it suited their interests. After the war, Byzantium reorganized its newly recovered possessions. New administrative and military structures were created in the lower Danube zone. The details remain debated, but what matters is that the empire now tried to anchor itself permanently in this frontier region. Still, these gains were not entirely secure. Civil wars and internal disorder after the death of John Tzimiskes weakened imperial control. In Bulgaria, the resistance of the local ruling house revived the old state in a new form, shifting its centre westward into the central Balkans. It was in connection with these struggles that one of the earliest secure references to the Vlachs south of the Danube appears, showing that Romanian-speaking communities were now visible on both sides of the river in the political record. In the early 11th century, under Basil II, Byzantium once again surged forward. After defeating internal enemies and restoring stability, Basil focused increasingly on the Balkans. One campaign followed another until Bulgaria was finally crushed. The conquest was completed in the second decade of the century, and Byzantine rule was reimposed across the Bulgarian lands. When the church organization of the conquered territories was arranged, a special diocese for the Vlachs of the former Bulgarian realm was included. This is highly important because it suggests that Byzantine ecclesiastical influence may also have reached the Romanian communities north of the Danube, tying them more closely to the Orthodox world of the Balkans. During Basil's long reign, peace returned to the lower Danube in a way that had not been seen for generations. Pecheneg invasions into the Balkans largely ceased. Diplomacy played a major role here. Earlier treaties with the Pechenegs seem to have been renewed, and Constantinople successfully prevented them from joining Bulgaria at critical moments. This calm coincided with another event of enormous importance: the Christianization of Kievan Rus under Vladimir. In the years that followed, Christianity spread more widely among the Eastern Slavs, and burial customs in some regions began to change accordingly. Not long after, the Hungarians also entered the Christian world, though in the Latin Rite rather than the Byzantine one. This meant that the Romanian communities, long surrounded by pagan nomads and mixed frontier societies, now found themselves between increasingly Christian neighbours. Their earlier confessional isolation was beginning to disappear. This new religious landscape had lasting consequences. Old Church Slavonic became the sacred and administrative language of much of the Carpathian Danubian world. It was adopted not only by Slavic states, but also later by the church and chancery of the Romanian principalities. This decision would shape Romanian political and ecclesiastical culture for centuries. It is one of the clearest examples of how the great transformations of the 10th and 11th centuries changed not just borders and alliances, but the deeper structure of cultural life. Even during this relative peace, however, the Pechenegs remained active elsewhere. They involved themselves in Rus politics, attacked when opportunities arose, and entered alliances with powers such as Poland against Kiev. In this context, both Pechenegs and Romanians appear in the struggles that followed the death of Vladimir. One Scandinavian saga, drawing on memories preserved by northern mercenaries who had served in the Rus lands, tells of a prince gathering an army of Turks, Wallachians, and other dangerous peoples. The Turks, in this case, were almost certainly Pechenegs. The Wallachians were Romanians living east of the Carpathians. This is an extraordinarily important glimpse into the role of the Romanian population in regional politics. It shows that they could be recruited into military struggles beyond their immediate homeland, not because they were subjects of Kiev, but because frontier warfare often depended on payment, alliance, and local opportunity. The name used in the saga for these Wallachians matches closely other Scandinavian references to the same people. Similar names appear in a runic inscription and in other Nordic writings that speak of the land of the Vlachs. Some later scholars tried to explain these words away by linking them to Cumans or other Turkic peoples. But such interpretations do not fit the chronology or the context. These Scandinavian forms clearly refer to the same people known elsewhere in Byzantine, Latin, and Slavic sources as Vlachs. In other words, even the northern literature preserves traces of the Romanian presence both in the Balkans and in the lands east of the Carpathians. By the second quarter of the 11th century, the pressure at the lower Danube increased again. Pecheneg raids into the Balkans became more frequent and more destructive. They struck Moesia, Thrace, Macedonia, and even threatened Kiev itself. Their growing offensive power was closely tied to a new shift in the steppe. The Uzes were pressing westward, and behind them another force was beginning to emerge: the Cumans. Steppe politics once again produced a chain reaction. As one nomadic people moved, another was pushed closer to the Danube. By this time, Byzantium was also weakening. After Basil's death, the throne passed to rulers who lacked his energy and military ability. The empire's strength at the frontier began to fade, and the Pechenegs took advantage of it. Their raids became more frequent, and the local population north of the Danube probably suffered heavily. It is likely that many people withdrew from the exposed plain into the wooded hills, seeking the protection of terrain that steppe horsemen found harder to master. Even the last major Rus attack on Constantinople in the 1040s followed the same old route past the mouths of the Danube, showing that this corridor remained active and dangerous to the very end. Then came another important turning point. Within the Pecheneg world itself, a split opened. A lesser leader named Kagan broke with the supreme ruler, Tyrak. Defeated in the struggle, Kagan and his followers fled first into the marshy Danube lands, and then onto an island near Dorostolon. From there, negotiations with Byzantium led to something remarkable. These Pechenegs were allowed to settle along the imperial frontier on the condition that they accept Christianity and serve the empire as military allies. Their chief received a Christian name and an official title from the emperor, proof that they had been drawn directly into the Byzantine system. Meanwhile, conflict continued between the Pechenegs on the two sides of the Danube. Tyrak protested that Byzantine support for Kagan violated earlier agreements. When his complaints were ignored, he prepared to strike back. Later chroniclers say that the entire Pecheneg people crossed into imperial territory, but such statements are clearly exaggerated. Even so, they reflect a reality that cannot be missed. The lower Danube had become the meeting point not only of empires and local societies, but of rival branches of the same nomadic people. The Great Crossing led by Tyrak was not simply a raid or a temporary military movement, it was a desperate migration. Pressed hard by the advance of the Uzes, the Pechenegs could no longer hold their ground north of the lower Danube. The frozen river, which in other seasons stood as a barrier, now became their road into the Byzantine world. Byzantine writers later described this moment in dramatic language, speaking of an entire people forced across the ice because another nomadic power was driving them from behind. The old classical names they used may sound confusing, but the reality behind them is clear. One steppe nation was being pushed aside by another, and the lands north of the Danube were no longer secure enough even for those who had once ruled them. This moment also shows something important about the lower Danube frontier. The danger facing Tyrak's Pechenegs did not come from local Romanian communities, which by that time did not possess the strength needed to expel such a powerful nomadic confederation. The real threat came from the east, from the advancing Uzes. Once the Pechenegs suffered defeat, they did not try to rebuild their power in the same lands north of the Danube. Instead, they preferred to move into the empire and place themselves under Byzantine authority. That choice alone reveals how unstable the northern frontier had become. Even so, not all Pechenegs followed Turkic into the Balkans. Some groups remained behind in the steppe. Over time, they lost their independence, entering other Turkic confederations or offering military service to the princes of Rus, who settled them along frontier zones near the open grasslands. Others had already survived farther east, living beside the Uzes since the earlier struggles around the Volga. This tells us that the Pecheneg world did not vanish all at once. It fractured. One part crossed into Byzantine lands, another stayed in the steppe, and each group had to find new ways to survive within a rapidly changing political landscape. For those Pechenegs who entered the Balkans, the migration created decades of turmoil for Byzantium. Far from becoming obedient frontier settlers, they often turned into a major source of disorder. They took advantage of imperial weakness, of revolts inside the empire, and of new invasions striking from other directions. At times, they resisted the provincial governors. At times, they joined local populations angered by taxes and administration. At times, they cooperated with other nomadic raiders crossing the Danube. The result was that Byzantium repeatedly lost control over wide parts of its lower Danube frontier. Imperial propaganda later tried to present this settlement as a triumph of policy and Christianization, but the reality was much harsher. The empire had not pacified the Pechenegs. It had admitted into its own territory a dangerous and unpredictable military society. As Byzantine influence weakened in the outer Carpathian lands, the strategic importance of the Turkic Nomads increased. Their presence between the Danube and the Balkan mountains became such a severe problem that even Byzantine authors, who were often inclined to rhetorical exaggeration, struggled to describe them strongly enough. They were presented as terrifying enemies, not only of the empire, but of the Christian world more broadly. Behind that dramatic language stood a simple truth. The lower Danube had become one of the most unstable frontiers in Europe. Byzantium's old method of setting one enemy against another no longer worked as effectively as it once had. During the period between Basil II and Alexius Comnenus, the empire often found that its neighbours were perfectly capable of cooperating with each other when it suited them. On one occasion, the emperor Isaac Comnenus had to confront a combined threat involving Hungarians and Pechenegs. He first drove back the Hungarians, then turned against the Pechenegs, some of whom submitted while others fought on among the marshes of the Danube. One outside chronicle even suggests that the emperor crossed the river in pursuit, though Byzantine writers do not clearly confirm such an expedition. Whether or not that crossing happened, the episode shows again that the frontier remained fluid. Power north and south of the Danube could not be separated neatly. During the same century, another transformation reshaped the steppe. After the Great Split within the Oghuz world, one branch moved toward the Islamic south and became associated with the Seljuk Turks, while another continued westward. Pressed by the Cumans, this western branch of the Uzes crossed the vast distance from the Volga to the Danube in remarkably little time. In doing so, they repeated the same pattern that had already driven the Pechenegs before them. Steppe history moved in waves. One confederation displaced another, and the force of that movement kept pushing westward. The first clashes between the Uzes and the Rus took place in the middle of the 11th century. Rus princes fought them, drove them from some of their lands, and added further pressure to the attacks already coming from the Cumans. This double blow made it impossible for the Uzes to remain in the old steppe zones north of the Black Sea. Some detachments likely reached the Bugyak and the Romanian plain not long after the Pechenegs had fled south. But the great concentration of ouzes north of the lower Danube came only when pressure from the Cumans became overwhelming and the Rus coalition forced them westward. Their stay there was brief. Soon they too crossed the Danube into Byzantine territory. That crossing, however, reveals something very important about the native population of the lower Danube plains. Byzantine writers say that the ouzes crossed not only with leather floats, which nomads commonly used, but also with boats and ships. That detail matters. Steppe nomads were not shipbuilders on any significant scale. If boats and vessels were available in large enough numbers, they were almost certainly obtained from the settled communities living in the Danube marshes and floodplains. In other words, even after years of nomadic pressure, the local population was still there, still active, and still capable of providing the material means for large river crossings. The plains had not been emptied. The Romanians of the lower Danube remained part of the landscape and part of the frontier economy. After the failure of the ouzes' invasion into Byzantium, some of their bands likely returned north of the Danube and settled again beside the Pecheneg groups that had remained there. This would not have been unusual. The steppe frontier was full of shattered tribes, splinter groups, and mercenary bands seeking temporary shelter. But unlike some older theories once imagined, there is no serious basis for seeing later mountain populations, such as the Hutsuls, as descendants of these Turkic nomads. A steppe, people choosing to settle permanently in high mountain country, would make little historical or archaeological sense. The evidence simply does not support such an idea. Then came the Cumans. They were the next great force of the steppe, and by the later 11th century their advance had reached the lower Danube region. Their first detachments probably entered the Bugiak not long after the ouzes crisis, and their first clear participation in Balkan affairs came when they joined the Pechenegs in raids against Byzantine lands. At first, their presence near the Danube was still limited. They needed Pecheneg cooperation for major operations, which suggests that their own local strength in the region was not yet overwhelming. But farther east, against the Rus, they were already becoming a dominant power. After defeating earlier nomadic rivals and securing control across the steppe, they emerged as the masters of the vast zone between the Aral region and the lower Danube. Even so, their presence in the lands of Bugiak and Baragan seems to have remained relatively light at first. Only later do we begin to see signs of a stronger and more lasting Cuman weight in those territories. Some Eastern traditions describe the Cumans as forcing surrounding peoples, including the Romanians, into submission. These claims are exaggerated when taken literally, especially in relation to powerful states such as Rus or Hungary. But they still preserve one important truth. The Romanian lands had become part of the wider Cuman world, even if not always under direct and uniform control. Meanwhile, Pecheneg groups still remained north of the Danube. In the late 11th century, one of their large raids struck through the Carpathians into Transylvania and Hungary. Medieval sources later disagreed about whether the attackers were Pechenegs or Cumans, but modern analysis strongly favours the Pechenegs. The confusion itself is understandable. By that time, the Cuman vanguard had already reached the Carpathian frontier, and medieval authors often used nomadic ethnic names loosely. What matters is that the lower Danube plains still served as a launching ground for mounted invasions across the mountain passes. As Byzantium declined after the catastrophe at Manzikert, and after the loss of its last Italian possessions, its ability to control the Danube frontier weakened even more. In Peristrian, the mixed population of the lower Danube towns and countryside joined forces with Pecheneg groups already living there or newly arrived from the north. Together, they sought autonomy from Byzantine rule. The local leaders who emerged at this moment have been the subject of endless debate, especially over their ethnicity. But one thing is increasingly clear. The Vlachs, meaning the Romanians of the Danube region, played a real part in this movement. A Syriac chronicler writing later also lists the Vlachs among the peoples who caused serious trouble to Emperor Alexius. That is a valuable sign that the Romanians were not simply passive villagers caught between nomads and empires. They were actors within the frontier struggle. The Pechenegs north of the Danube also reinforced this anti-Byzantine world in Peristrian. They crossed into the Balkans again in the 1080s, fleeing renewed Cuman pressure. This is another sign that the lands north of the river still contained Pecheneg groups, even after the Great Migration into the empire. The Cumans, hoping to extend their power to the Danube line, threatened them there just as they had threatened other steppe peoples before. Byzantine weakness allowed all of these tensions to erupt at once. Cumans, Pechenegs, dissident frontier rulers, and even Hungarian claimants all became entangled in raids and campaigns south of the Danube. Yet this same chaos also created the conditions for one of Byzantium's last major triumphs. The alliance between Pechenegs and Cumans was never stable. They quarrelled over plunder and over leadership. Emperor Alexius understood how to exploit that division. In 1091, with crucial Cuman support, he won a decisive victory over the Pechenegs at Labunian. That battle destroyed Pecheneg power in the Balkans and restored Byzantine authority on the Danube frontier. It was one of the last great recoveries of the empire as a major European power. The defeat also sent a warning to the Cumans. Though they had helped destroy the Pechenegs, they quickly withdrew north of the Danube after the campaign. Still, the lower Danube was not pacified for long. Within weeks, Cuman raiders were again moving into the Balkans. Their operations remained fluid, fast, and opportunistic. At this stage, however, the strongest Cuman centres still lay farther east, especially in the Dnieper basin. Their most famous leaders were better known for campaigns against Rus than for permanent control near the Danube. This suggests that the Cumans of the Danube frontier were still relatively limited in number and depended on support from the broader confederation behind them. Soon after returning from the Balkans, Cuman forces launched another raid across the Carpathians into Transylvania and Hungary. Their route most likely ran through southern Moldavia, which by now had become the natural highway for such steppe offensives. From central Transylvania, they spread westward, carrying off booty and captives until the Hungarian king struck back and defeated them. Once again, southern Moldavia appears not as a quiet borderland, but as one of the main corridors through which the great military movements of the age passed. After years of attacking Byzantium and Hungary, the Cumans shifted their attention once more toward the middle Dnieper and the lands of Rus. Drought in the steppe may have played a role in this renewed aggression, as environmental stress so often did in nomadic history. But the larger pattern remained the same. The lower Danube, the Bugiak, and the plains of Wallachia and southern Moldavia were repeatedly drawn into the chain reaction of steppe politics. Pechenegs, Uzes, and Cumans did not move randomly. They followed pressure, opportunity, and survival, and every time they moved, the Romanian lands at the western end of the steppe felt the consequences. Even while the Cumans were deeply involved in wars across the lands of southern Rus, they still responded when a pretender claiming to be a son of Romanus Diogenes asked for their military support in the mid-1090s. That detail alone shows how wide their influence had become. The appeal seems to have reached them near Cherson, and one of the leaders connected with the campaign was Tugorkan, a figure well known from the larger Cuman world of the North Pontic steppe. This makes it very likely that the forces that moved into the Balkans came from the great Cuman sphere north of the Black Sea, not from some small isolated frontier band. Their invasion at first went remarkably well. They entered Peristrion with little difficulty. helped in no small part by the fact that Emperor Alexius was still unpopular in the early years of his rule. Local support mattered here. Vlach communities in the Balkans appear to have guided the Cumans through the mountain passes, and some fortresses seem to have opened their gates to them. That is a striking sign of how deeply resentment against Byzantine authority had grown in parts of the region. This hostility of the Balkan Vlachs was not a passing detail. It helps explain why the political life of the region would remain unstable throughout the 12th century, and why later uprisings could take root so effectively. Several medieval writers noticed that the Vlachs were often unfriendly to imperial officials and rule from Constantinople. In this case, their cooperation with the Cumans reveals a frontier society willing to use outside military force in order to weaken the empire. The Cumans pushed as far as Anchialos and Adrianople, which shows how dangerous the invasion had become. But the campaign eventually lost its momentum. The pretender around whom the expedition had gathered was captured, confusion spread through his camp, and the Byzantine army managed to recover. The Cumans were beaten and driven back. After that setback, they did not dare mount another major invasion of the empire for roughly 2 decades. Even so, the danger never fully disappeared. The Danube frontier remained tense, and Byzantium knew it. When the crusading armies began to cross imperial lands, the emperors paid special attention to the northern border. Imperial policy relied not only on military strength, but also on gifts, titles, and diplomacy. The empire tried to calm the restless powers beyond the frontier by giving honours and rewards to those it could not safely confront at once. In this context, the peoples being managed most carefully were very likely the Cumans and the Hungarians. Byzantium also recruited steppe auxiliaries for frontier service. During the passage of the Crusaders at the end of the 11th century, Cuman and Pecheneg troops, and perhaps even Uzis as well, were present near the Danube as part of the wider imperial defence system. This shows once again how flexible Byzantine frontier policy could be. Nomads who raided the empire in one year might serve it in the next. At the same time, the Cumans remained deeply entangled in the politics of the lands north of the lower Danube. In the late 11th century, they are found assisting princes in the southwestern Rus lands against the Hungarian king. On that occasion, their intervention was devastating. The Hungarian army was destroyed, and its survivors fled back through the northern Carpathian passes. A few years later, another Cuman raid into Volhynia was repelled, and the defeated nomads then withdrew toward the Danube frontier. That small detail is important because it suggests that at least some Cuman groups were already based close to the lower Danube, not merely passing through from the distant steppe. By the early 12th century, the western edge of the Cuman world was firmly pressing against the Romanian plain and the lands around the mouths of the Danube. This became even clearer during the invasion of 1114. The Cumans who threatened the empire in that year seemed to have come from the neighbouring plain north of the river, especially from the western Romanian plain. When Emperor Alexius moved against them, they avoided direct battle and quickly recrossed the Danube. The Byzantines pursued them for days, which suggests both that the crossing points were known and that the empire was maintaining close watch over the frontier. The military response also shows that Byzantine control of the Danube line was still effective under the Comnenian rulers. Before the invasion could fully develop, Alexius had enough warning to move troops into the right positions and prepare the defence of the northern Balkans. So while the Cumans were dangerous, they were not yet in a position to dominate the lower Danube frontier without resistance. During the later years of Alexius, Byzantium again became the strongest political force in the region nearest the steppe lands. Yet this renewed strength did not mean the frontier was secure in every direction. The empire still faced pressure from the Rus princes, from Hungary, and from the Cumans themselves. In response, Constantinople adjusted its diplomacy. Alexius even sought marriage ties with a Rus prince who was linked to the Cumans and hostile to both Hungary and Kiev. In doing so, Byzantine policy showed a familiar logic. It preferred balance to certainty and alliance to isolation. At the same time, Kievan rulers were not free from older ambitions. There are traditions suggesting that Prince Vladimir Monomakh took an interest in the Danube region and may even have dreamed of reviving the old southern ambitions associated with Sviatoslav. Whether or not all the details preserved in the chronicles are exact, it is clear that the mouths of the Danube still held political and strategic attraction for the rulers of Rus. Yet large-scale military expansion into that zone remained difficult. The nomads controlling the steppe north of the Black Sea stood in the way of any stable Rus advance. Trade, however, was another matter. Archaeological finds from Byzantine towns in Dobruja show the presence of goods from Rus in the 12th and 13th centuries. That points to growing commercial connections, even where conquest remained unrealistic. Once again, the lower Danube appears not only as a battlefield, but also as a corridor of exchange linking river worlds, steppe worlds, and imperial markets. Peace along the frontier did not last forever. In the early 1120s, another large nomadic army crossed into the Balkans. Byzantine and Syriac writers disagree on whether these invaders should be called Pechenegs or Cumans, but the campaign almost certainly involved a mixed nomadic force. Some eastern tribes had recently been driven from Rus by Vladimir Monomakh, and it is very likely that part of this displaced population moved toward the Danube. The Berendei found refuge first in Hungary and later returned eastward, while Pechenegs and Uzis probably turned toward the Balkans with their families and wagons. Cuman groups near the lower Danube may have joined them as well. What matters is that this was not just a raid by a compact tribal host. It was a wider migration movement, the kind of armed displacement so typical of steppe history. Byzantine sources describe several tribal units, under separate leaders taking part in this incursion. Even if Cumans were involved, the leading role seems to have belonged to the Pechenegs, which is why the Byzantine victory over the invaders was later celebrated as a triumph specifically over them. This was effectively the last major Pecheneg challenge to the empire. After this defeat, they ceased to be a serious independent force in Balkan politics and gradually disappear from the record, except for occasional mentions during the Crusading Age and in frontier warfare. For a quarter of a century after that, the lower Danube was spared the kind of large-scale nomadic invasion that had so often devastated it before. Under John Comnenus, the frontier was kept under control, whether by force, diplomacy, or subsidies. During these decades of relative calm, Moldavia and the lands north of the lower Danube no longer served as the main launching ground for repeated attacks into the Balkans. Byzantine policy toward the Cumans seems to have aimed above all at keeping them quiet while the empire dealt with other enemies, especially the Seljuk Turks, the Normans, and the Hungarians. At the same time, the Cumans were also being held in check by pressure from Rus. Vladimir Monomakh's campaigns into the steppe created serious difficulties for them and may even have encouraged one important Cuman group to leave for Georgia, where they entered the service of King David the Builder. This is another reminder that the lower Danube frontier was shaped not only by local events, but by forces and decisions stretching from the Caucasus to the Carpathians. After Monomakh's death, however, the Cumans became more active again. They re-entered the politics of Rus and even attacked Poland. Under Manuel Comnenus, the Byzantine presence beyond the frontier was once again strongly felt, but Manuel's ambitions were broad and exhausting. He wanted to project imperial power across seas and frontiers, and that meant constant campaigning. Relations with the Cumans became tenser. In 1148, they crossed the Danube and began to plunder. Yet when Manuel came against them, they withdrew quickly, suggesting that they still did not wish to test their strength directly against the full imperial army. Some Byzantine accounts place the fighting in a zone whose name has caused much debate, possibly somewhere in the lower Danube plain. One nomadic leader mentioned in connection with these events bore the Christian name Lazarus, which may point to the involvement of a local Romanian ruler, cooperating with the steppe forces. If that is correct, then we again see how local powers in the frontier region could align themselves with nomadic armies when it suited their interests. A few years later, while Manuel was tied down by larger imperial concerns, the Cumans struck again. They ravaged fortresses along the Danube and defeated troops sent against them. The imperial response was extraordinary. Rather than merely defending the frontier, Manuel sent an expedition toward the Sea of Azov, attempting to strike at the nomads closer to their own base. The result is unclear, and that very uncertainty suggests the campaign achieved little. Still, it shows how seriously Byzantium took the Cuman problem. Another invasion followed not long after. Even if the nomads again withdrew quickly before a major battle, the repeated attacks of that decade make one thing plain. Cuman strength north of the Danube was growing steadily. By the middle of the 12th century, observers in Central Europe already described the lands east and southeast of Hungary as a huge zone belonging to Pechenegs and Cumans, rich in hunting grounds but poor in agriculture. The wording may preserve some older memory alongside contemporary reality, but it reflects a real frontier world in which older Pecheneg remnants likely still survived under broader Cuman dominance. After the last of these repeated raids, however, the Cumans no longer crossed the Danube in force for some time. That suggests some kind of accommodation may have been reached between Manuel and the steppe powers. There are hints that relations improved enough for Byzantium to think of the Cumans not only as enemies, but as useful diplomatic partners. One Western chronicle even claims that Manuel warned the rulers of Turkey, Babylon, Persia, and Cumania about the possible ambitions of Frederick Barbarossa. Whether or not the threat described there was realistic matters less than what the report implies. It shows that the Cumans were being treated as rulers of a recognized and significant political space. They were no longer merely raiders from the margins. They had become a major force whose friendship or hostility had to be weighed in imperial strategy. By the middle of the 12th century, the lands beyond the Carpathians were being shaken not only by Cuman horsemen, but also by the ambitions of exiled princes and imperial rebels. Southern Moldavia had become a refuge, a corridor, and a political stage where men driven out of power tried to rebuild their fortunes. Two such figures stand out sharply. One was Ivan Rostislavich, known as the Berladnik, a restless claimant to power in Galicia. The other was Andronicus Comnenus, a brilliant and dangerous member of the Byzantine imperial family, always moving between favour and conspiracy. Both were men of noble birth. Both were bold, unpredictable, and ambitious, and both were drawn into the Romanian lands east of the Carpathians at moments when fortune turned against them. Ivan Rostislavich first appeared near the Danube in the 1140s after failing to seize Galicia. Like so many displaced princes of the age, he drifted from one court to another, hoping that shifting alliances might yet restore him. He passed through Kiev and other princely centres, becoming part of the violent politics that gripped Rus after the death of Vladimir Monomakh. Then, in the late 1150s, he returned to the lands north of the lower Danube, where he began preparing a new attempt against the Galician ruler Yaroslav Osmomysl. His forces were not insignificant. He gathered several thousand men known as Berladniks, and was joined by many Cumans from southern Moldavia. Even before the campaign fully began, his men attacked boats belonging to Galician fishermen on the Danube, a sign that this was no simple act of refuge but a real military preparation. Yet, when the expedition moved toward the Galician frontier, it failed. Ivan did not have the strength to overthrow his rival. His following broke apart, and he fled once more. What matters most in this episode is the setting. Ivan chose the lower Danube and southern Moldavia as a place from which to rebuild power. That tells us a great deal about the region. It was not an empty no-man's land. It was a space where political exiles could gather men, negotiate with nomads, and prepare armed ventures. It stood close enough to Galicia to matter, yet far enough away to offer temporary safety. It was also a land in which local power structures and steppe alliances could be used by skilled adventurers. Ivan's story did not end there. Soon after, he appeared farther east, near the Dnieper estuary, still active, still moving, still searching for a new chance. In the end, he fled into Byzantine territory and died at Thessaloniki, likely eliminated in a way that suited Byzantine diplomacy. His death may have been intended to please the ruler of Galicia at a time when relations between Byzantium and Hungary were tense. In that sense, even his final refuge became part of a larger diplomatic game. A few years later, another exile entered the same broad frontier world. This time, it was Andronicus Comnenus, one of the most remarkable and dangerous aristocrats of the Byzantine age. He had escaped imprisonment and was trying to build support against Emperor Manuel. On his way toward Galicia, he was caught by Romanians in Moldavia. He managed to escape and eventually reached the Galician court, where he was received favourably. This episode is extremely important because it contains one of the earliest clear references to Romanians north of the Danube. It also shows that these Romanian communities were not cut off from imperial politics. They acted in the interest of Manuel, which suggests that Byzantine influence beyond the Danube was strong enough to matter in local decisions. The empire was not ruling these lands directly, but it clearly had agents, friends, and loyalists there. Manuel's ambitions in the region were much wider than the fate of a single fugitive prince. He was determined not only to defend the Danube frontier, but to project Byzantine power beyond it. One of the clearest examples came in 1166 when he launched a campaign across the Danube against Hungary. This was not a simple border raid. It was a large and carefully planned operation involving feints, diversions, and coordinated troop movements. A major role in this expedition was played by an army led by Leo Vatatzes, which included many Vlachs. A Byzantine chronicler even remarked that these Vlachs were believed to descend from Roman colonists from Italy. Whether that idea came from learned speculation or from the Vlachs' own pride in their origin, it is a striking sign of how identity was remembered in the region. The use of Vlach troops in this campaign was not accidental. The Byzantine army appears to have crossed in the lower Danube zone and then moved toward the bend of the Carpathians, likely using routes through lands inhabited by Romanians. Recruiting Vlachs was therefore not just a military choice. It was also a way of securing safe movement through a region where the empire relied on local knowledge, local cooperation, and perhaps local sympathy. Manuel was not only fighting Hungary, he was also trying to shape the balance of power in the outer Carpathian lands and prevent the Hungarian crown from extending its authority too far beyond the mountains. That possibility must be taken seriously. Trade between Hungary and the lands south and east of the Carpathians was already real by the 12th century, as shown by Hungarian coins found in Wallachia and Oltenia. Economic contact did not automatically mean political domination, but it certainly created openings that kings could later try to exploit. Manuel's intervention may therefore have had a double purpose. It weakened Hungary militarily, but it may also have aimed to block any Hungarian expansion into the Romanian lands outside the Carpathian Arc. At the same time, any Byzantine action in this zone had to take the Cumans into account. If left unmanaged, they could destroy an army's plans simply by striking at the wrong moment. That is why Byzantine diplomacy worked so hard to keep them quiet, divide them, or even recruit them. This web of diplomacy, local politics, and frontier war becomes even clearer when we look at the military forces employed by the Hungarian kings. In the 12th century, Hungary made broad use of auxiliary troops recruited from inside and outside the kingdom. Yet Romanian auxiliaries do not clearly appear in Hungarian service before the early 13th century. That silence may reflect distrust. The Romanians of Transylvania and the outer Carpathian lands either had little desire to fight for the Hungarian crown, or the kings did not fully trust communities living in regions where royal control was still incomplete. Instead, the Hungarian rulers often turned to steppe peoples, or even Muslim origin groups from Eastern Europe. These men probably reached Hungary either through the northern passes or across the outer Carpathian lands. Their presence shows again how open and connected this frontier remained. As for Moldavia itself, some historians once claimed that it had fallen under Galician rule in the 12th century. That idea rested mainly on a supposed charter associated with Ivan Rostislavich, and on a poetic passage praising the Galician ruler Iaroslav Osmomysl. But neither argument stands up well. The charter in question has long been shown to be a forgery. The poem, meanwhile, is full of heroic exaggeration and was clearly designed to glorify its prince. It speaks in the language of epic praise, not in the language of precise political geography. Even more importantly, the authenticity of the poem itself has been strongly challenged by major modern scholars, so it cannot be treated as reliable proof that Galicia ruled all the way to the Danube. Archaeology points in the same direction. The presence of objects from Rus in Moldavia shows trade and religious contact, not conquest. If the Galician princes had truly controlled southern Moldavia, it would be hard to explain why Ivan Rostislavich repeatedly fled there for safety when he was in conflict with them. A man does not normally seek refuge in the territory of the ruler he is trying to overthrow. Southern Moldavia was therefore not a Galician province, nor was it a Byzantine province. It was a frontier world inhabited above all by local Romanians and dominated politically, to a large extent, by steppe nomads, especially the Cumans. This is why the old image of the lower Danube as an empty refuge for any wandering prince is also misleading. Some historians imagine that men like the Berladniks, the Brodniks, and other loosely defined groups made southern Moldavia into a kind of lawless political refuge. But archaeology does not support the idea of a population directly transplanted from Rus into this region. The material culture found there is much closer to that of other Romanian lands on both sides of the Carpathians than to the core lands of Rus. Trade links certainly existed and imported objects are real, but that is very different from political control or mass migration. The nomadic picture is more complex. Recent research suggests that the Cuman presence near the lower Danube in the 11th and 12th centuries was often temporary and episodic. The main Cuman centres remained the east. At the same time, Pecheneg and Uz groups continued to survive on the left bank of the lower Danube, some of them perhaps still connected in one way or another to Byzantine military arrangements. Even so, it is very unlikely that these older steppe groups could have completely escaped Cuman domination. More probably, the region was a layered frontier where Pechenegs, Uzes, Cumans, and Romanians all coexisted under shifting relations of power, tribute, alliance, and dependence. All of this forms the background to one of the greatest upheavals in late 12th century Balkan history, the Great Rebellion of 1185, led by the brothers Peter and Asen. Their uprising took Byzantium by surprise. For nearly 2 decades, the empire struggled to crush it, but in the end failed. The rebellion began in the Balkan Mountains, in a region well suited for resistance, where Vlach communities lived among steep terrain and easily defended strongholds. Yet the real strength of the movement did not come only from the mountains south of the Danube. It also depended heavily on the populations and alliances north of the river. That became clear almost immediately. In 1186, when Emperor Isaac II launched his first campaign against the rebels, Peter and Asen crossed the Danube to the north and returned with Cuman support. From that point on, Cuman cavalry became one of the decisive military tools of the rebellion. They were drawn in by the promise of plunder and by the opportunity offered by Byzantine weakness. Their light horsemen gave the rebels speed, striking power, and flexibility, turning what might have remained a local revolt into a far wider and more dangerous war. Once again, the lands north of the Danube proved to be essential to what happened south of it. By the late 12th century, the struggle south of the Danube could no longer be separated from what was happening north of it. The Vlach and Bulgarian revolt against Byzantium had already become a major challenge, but its strength grew even more once Cuman cavalry joined the war. These mounted warriors first fought beside the rebels against the Byzantines, and later they would also appear in the fighting against the Latin Empire. Even after Byzantine political influence weakened in the Romanian plain, the empire did not disappear completely from the region. Byzantine coins continued to circulate there, and some were buried in hoards during times of unrest, a silent sign that trade, payment, and political tension were still deeply connected. Most historians have assumed that the Cumans who supported the Asen brothers came mainly from the lands immediately north of the lower Danube. But the evidence points to a wider reality. A major chronicle from the Galician and Volhynian lands suggests that the Cumans helping the revolt were not only local groups from the Danube frontier, but also forces drawn from the Dnieper region. In the late 1180s, while the rebellion was unfolding in the Balkans, Rus forces attacked Cuman camps beyond the Dnieper and found them weakly defended because many of the Cuman warriors had already gone toward the Danube. A few years later, the same chronicle again notes that Cumans from the Dnieper zone moved toward the lower Danube, creating another opening for their enemies to strike their abandoned settlements. This is a powerful detail. It shows that the Asenid revolt was not backed only by neighbouring nomads, but by a much larger Cuman military network stretching far into the steppe. The rebellion also drew in Romanians from the left bank of the Danube. Greek sources explicitly mention Vlachs and Cumans crossing the river from north to south in support of the conflict near the end of the 12th century. That means the struggle was not confined to the Balkans. It was fed by people, alliances, and military manpower coming from the Romanian lands north of the river. It is very possible that this participation had begun even earlier, before the sources speak of it clearly. The Danube, in this moment, did not divide 2 separate worlds. It connected them. Another group mentioned in these campaigns may also have had roots in the lands east of the Carpathians. Greek writers refer to warriors called Bordones, and many historians believe this name points to the Brodniks, who appear later in the historical record of southern Moldavia. If that identification is correct, then these frontier communities were already active in the region by the late 12th century and had become part of the military world surrounding the lower Danube. As the 13th century opened, the political map of the region became even more unstable. The Byzantine emperor, unable to restore order in the Balkans on his own, called on the Prince of Gallic-Volhynia, Roman Mstislavich, to strike at the Cumans. Roman's raids helped reduce the pressure of Cuman attacks on Thrace for a time, but they did not restore Byzantine control in any lasting way. His success was soon interrupted by new fighting in Rus, where rival princes allied themselves with Cuman leaders against him. The steppe and the forest zone remained deeply linked, and every war in one quickly affected the other. After Roman's death, internal divisions in Rus opened the way for Hungarian intervention in Gallic Volhynia. Once the Hungarian crown established even temporary authority there, it quickly began presenting itself as ruler of those lands. But the political ambitions of Hungary did not stop at Galicia and Volhynia. They also turned toward the neighbouring lands south and east of the Carpathians, territories inhabited largely by Romanians. At the same time, Hungarian control inside Transylvania was becoming firmer. This was the period when Saxon settlers and Szechlers were more firmly established there, and when the eastern mountain frontier began to receive more organised military attention. One revealing example is the fortress built at Batka Domne, near Piatra Neamț. Its position allowed control over one of the important routes linking Moldavia with Transylvania through the Bistrița Valley. Excavations there have produced crosses of Rus origin, but that does not mean a Rus population was stationed there. In that area, the only Orthodox population at the time was Romanian, which makes it highly likely that the garrison was made up of Romanians. This fits well with later reports that Romanians and Szechlers guarded the eastern Carpathian passes during the time of the Mongol invasion. By this stage, Romanians were no longer simply living along the frontier. They were being drawn into the military systems of the kingdoms and powers surrounding them. Meanwhile, the Cumans were no longer fighting only in the Balkans and in Rus. They had also become important in the Caucasus. The Georgian king, David the Builder, settled large numbers of them on his lands and used them as military colonists and mercenaries in his struggles against neighbouring enemies. This shows how wide the Cuman world had become. Their warriors could be found from the Danube to the Caucasus, serving as raiders, allies, settlers, or royal troops depending on the political moment. Then came one of the greatest shocks of medieval history: the fall of Constantinople to the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The Byzantine Empire shattered, and its lands were divided among the conquerors, Venice, and several Greek successor states. For the lands north of the lower Danube, this mattered enormously. Byzantine influence, which had long shaped the political and commercial world of the region, was now much weaker. In the Balkans, the old conflict between Byzantium and the Assanids was replaced by a bitter struggle between the Second Bulgarian state and the new Latin Empire. Once again, the Cumans remained on the side of the Assanid rulers. In 1205, their cavalry played a key role in the great victory near Adrianople, where the Latin Emperor Baldwin was captured and later died in captivity. This was a stunning reversal. A new power in the Balkans had risen with strong Cuman support. Yet Cuman alliances were never simple or fully reliable. The same nomadic world that could help a ruler rise could also turn against him. There are traditions suggesting that the Assanid ruler, known as Ioanitsa, may have fallen victim to a conspiracy led by a Cuman chief. Whether every detail is true or not, the larger point remains valid. The alliance between Balkan rulers and steppe cavalry was powerful but unstable. As more Cumans moved south of the Danube and became involved in Balkan wars, their military strength north of the river appears to have weakened. This helps explain why, in the early 13th century, they suffered several defeats. Around 1210, a Transylvanian force led by Joachim of Sibiu advanced toward Vidin and defeated Cuman leaders in battle. His army was especially important because of who marched within it: Saxons, Romanians, Szechlers, and Pechenegs. This is one of the clearest signs that by this time the Hungarian kingdom was drawing Romanians into military service on a visible scale. The frontier was being reorganized, and local populations were now active participants in the campaigns that shaped it. A year later, in 1211, the Hungarian king invited the Teutonic Knights into the Barsa land to strengthen the defence of southeastern Transylvania against frequent Cuman raids. At first, this seemed like a practical answer to a real threat. The Teutonic Knights built fortifications and improved security. But they did not stop at defence. They began expanding beyond the mountains into the lands outside the Carpathian Arc, trying to establish military control there as well. Later documents claimed that the territory under their influence reached as far as the lands of the Brodniks, and even toward the Danube, though such claims were clearly exaggerated. Even if those texts are not fully reliable, there is no doubt that the order attempted to push beyond the mountains and reshape the political frontier. Their expansion could not have covered the entire distance to the Danube in so short a time. At most, they controlled a strip of land immediately beyond the southeastern passes. Still, their presence mattered. It represented a new attempt by the Hungarian crown and its allies to project power into regions that had long been under the influence of steppe nomads and local Romanian communities. But the experiment did not last. Conflicts with the Hungarian king soon erupted, especially because the Teutonic Knights acted too independently and preferred to answer to the papacy rather than to the crown. In 1225, they were expelled by force. The lands into which they had moved were never truly empty, despite what some royal documents claimed. Medieval charters often spoke of deserted or uninhabited regions when granting land to settlers or military orders. But these formulas were political language, not literal truth. In reality, such areas often bordered Romanian settlements, and some were only thinly populated or partly cultivated, not vacant. The same pattern appears again and again in frontier history. A land described as empty turns out to be inhabited by people who did not fit easily into the legal or political categories of the ruling power. At the same time, the Cumans themselves were suffering blows from several directions. In the east, they were attacked by the ruler of Khwarezm and forced to yield territory. In Crimea, they lost control of Sudak to a sudden Seljuk expedition. Their military power, never fully centralized, was now stretched across too many fronts. This helps explain why their authority in the outer Carpathian and lower Danube regions appears more fragile in the early 13th century than it had been before. Soon a far greater danger appeared. The Mongols, advancing first against Khwarezm and then sweeping north of the Caucasus, shattered first the Alans and then the Cumans. Sudak was plundered, panic spread across the steppe, and the Cuman Khan Kuthan urgently sought help from the Rus princes. For a moment, old enemies joined forces. Cumans and Rus assembled a large coalition army to resist the new invaders. Some Galician warriors even moved by river and sea along the Dnester and Dnieper systems to join the campaign. That detail again reminds us that the great rivers of the region were still major lines of movement, in war as well as trade. The result was disaster. In 1223, at the river Kalka, the Mongols destroyed the allied Cuman and Rus forces. The defeat was made worse by treachery from the Brodniks, whose leader switched sides during the battle. Yet even after this victory, the Mongols did not immediately conquer all the western steppe. They had marched too far and fought too long to begin a full occupation at once. For the moment, they withdrew. But the message was unmistakable. A new power had arrived in Eurasia, one far more dangerous than the steppe confederations that had ruled before. The Cumans understood this. Their eastern territories had already begun to fall under Mongol pressure, and they knew a greater storm was coming. In response, they turned toward Hungary and asked to be baptized into Christianity. This request was made in the late 1220s, and it was not imposed on them from outside. The initiative came from the Cumans themselves. They were seeking not only a new faith, but protection, recognition, and a new political position in a world that was collapsing around them. The future Hungarian king, Béla, and the Archbishop of Esztergom quickly recognized the opportunity. Conversion could become a tool of influence. Through Christianity, the Hungarian crown hoped to draw the Cumans into its own orbit and extend both political and religious power farther into the lands east of the Carpathians. The Cumans were not unique in turning toward Christianity when danger closed in around them. Again and again, the nomadic rulers of the steppe accepted baptism not because they had suddenly abandoned their old world, but because conversion could open the door to protection, alliance, and survival. Before the disaster at the Kalka River, one Cuman prince had already accepted baptism in the lands of Rus, hoping that Christian rulers there might help him resist the Mongols. Others had done the same earlier, entering the service of Rus princes and embracing the faith of the courts that sheltered them. Much the same pattern could be seen elsewhere. Pecheneg leaders accepted baptism when Byzantium allowed them to settle inside the empire. Turkic groups in Byzantine service often did the same. In Georgia, Cuman warriors who had entered royal service were also drawn into the Christian world. In every case, religion and politics moved together. The Christian states of Eastern Europe did not convert nomads out of pure missionary zeal alone. Conversion was also a way to bind dangerous steppe warriors to a new political order. This is exactly how the Hungarian crown approached the Cumans in the late 1220s. Their conversion, encouraged strongly by Dominican missionaries, led to the creation of a bishopric that carried the name of Cumania. A Dominican bishop was placed at its head with papal approval. But the geography of this bishopric reveals something extremely important. It was not centered in the open steppe, where the Cumans actually lived in large numbers. Instead, it included part of southeastern Transylvania and an uncertain area east of the Carpathian Bend, likely not extending much beyond the Seret. In other words, the bishopric, called Cuman, was in reality planted in a region where the dominant settled population was Romanian and where the landscape itself, with hills and mountains, was poorly suited to nomadic life. A papal letter from the 1230s makes the situation even clearer. It says openly that in this supposed Cuman bishopric there lived many people called Walati, meaning Romanians. It adds that some Hungarians, Germans, and others who had gone to live among them had joined them and adopted the Orthodox faith. The Pope also complained that these Romanians had their own bishops, who did not obey the Catholic bishop placed over the territory. From Rome's point of view, they were false bishops, men whose authority was unacceptable because it lay outside papal control. But for us, this detail is enormously important. It proves that long before Catholic missionaries tried to reorganize the frontier, there were already functioning Orthodox ecclesiastical structures among the Romanians, east of the Carpathians. That fact opens a much larger historical question. If the Romanians there had their own bishops, then they almost certainly had local political structures capable of sustaining them. Medieval bishoprics did not float in empty space. They existed within living communities and usually within some form of organized power. The surviving evidence does not allow us to define exactly how large those Romanian political formations were, or what shape they took. But it is very hard to believe that bishops, clergy, and organized resistance to Catholic authority could have existed without local rulers, communities, and institutions standing behind them. Some historians have tried to explain these Orthodox structures simply as an extension of church authority coming from the Bulgarian lands, south of the Danube. That connection probably did exist on a religious level, especially after the collapse of Byzantine authority in the Balkans and the rise of the Second Bulgarian Empire. Yet the papal complaint points to something more rooted than outside influence alone. What we see is not a missionary outpost suddenly appearing among unorganized villages. We see an already existing Romanian religious world, one that was capable of resisting Catholic pressure and protecting its own hierarchy. This also helps explain why the so-called Cuman bishopric was, in many ways, a misleading name. It did not reflect a territory fully conquered from the Cumans or a region already transformed by Dominican success. It was a project, not a completed reality. The name expressed Hungarian and papal ambition more than local truth. It pointed toward what they hoped to achieve in the future: the conversion of the nomads, the extension of Catholic structures, and the political expansion of the Hungarian kingdom into the lands beyond the Carpathians. In that sense, the bishopric was less a description of the frontier than a declaration of intent. At first, this project inspired real optimism. If the Cumans could be drawn into Christianity, then perhaps the whole eastern frontier could be pushed farther and farther into the steppe. The missionary energy of the age was strong, and the Hungarian church saw in it a chance to combine salvation with political enlargement. Yet the reality proved far more difficult. The Dominicans had entered a cultural world very different from Catholic Europe. Nomadic life was hard to reshape. The steppe was also a zone where Islam had already made serious inroads, and in some ways Islam may have been better suited to the social life of nomadic peoples than Latin Christianity. For all their zeal, the missionaries were trying to transform a world they only partly understood. Even so, the Hungarian kings did not abandon their advance. Little by little they continued to push into the outer Carpathian lands, despite resistance from both nomads and natives. Some Cuman groups, especially those near the lower Danube who had partly accepted Christianity, may have been willing to cooperate with Hungary for their own reasons. The old unity of the Cuman world was already beginning to crack. This can be seen during the campaign of Prince Bela against Galicia in 1229. He had Cuman allies on his side, while the Galician Prince Daniel also called on Cumans, led by Cotian. For the first time, two Cuman groups living close to the Romanian lands clearly appear on opposite sides of a major war. That is a strong sign that the tribal confederation was splitting internally, and that older bonds were weakening under political strain. Bela's campaign failed. Forced to retreat, he crossed the Dniester and withdrew through Moldavia toward the Prut, then back over the mountains into Transylvania. That route matters. It shows that these lands east of the Carpathians were not inaccessible margins. They were active military corridors linking Galicia, Moldavia, and Transylvania. Armies could move through them, retreat through them, and try to control them. A few years later, another displaced prince fleeing conflict in Galicia seems to have used a similar road through Moldavia toward Rodna in Transylvania. Such episodes reveal again how important the outer Carpathian zone had become in the politics of the age. At the same time, the Hungarian kings were turning their ambitions more openly southward. The title King of Cumania, adopted in the early 1230s, was not just ceremonial language. It reflected a concrete attempt to claim authority over lands previously dominated by local Romanian rulers and Cuman chiefs. The establishment of the Severin Banate belongs to the same moment and the same political logic. Hungary was no longer content with holding Transylvania alone. It was looking beyond the mountains, toward Wallachia, toward the Danube, and toward the territories inhabited by Orthodox and partly pagan populations. In these decades, the Hungarian kingdom became the most aggressive and energetic power in the middle and lower Danube region. This expansion also had a religious dimension. Hungary acted with the blessing of the papacy, and the language of crusade, mission, and defence of the faith gave political expansion a sacred tone. To resist Hungarian advance often meant, in practice, to resist Catholic penetration. That is why political and confessional conflict became so closely intertwined in the Romanian lands east of the Carpathians. The weakening of Byzantium and the fragmentation of the Orthodox world after the fall of Constantinople had created an opening. No Eastern Christian centre possessed enough authority to counterbalance the Catholic push with equal force. The Hungarian crown and the church hierarchy understood this very well and moved to take advantage of it. Among the frontier peoples involved in this world were the Brodniks. They appear repeatedly in charters, papal documents, Rus chronicles, and Byzantine histories. They were active in southern Moldavia and nearby regions, and took part in wars involving Rus princes and steppe powers. Some older scholars once tried to identify them with the Romanians, but that idea does not hold up. Contemporary sources consistently use other names for the Romanians, names derived from the word Vlach. It would make little sense for the same writers to use an entirely different ethnic term for the same population. Nor is there convincing evidence that the Brodniks were simply Russians or proto-Cossacks of some sort. Their name itself suggests wandering or roaming, and their presence in many frontier zones points more toward a mobile steppe people, probably of Turkic background, though known under a Slavic label. A similarly confusing case is that of the Bolokhovans, a population living farther northeast, in the lands connected to Galicia and Volhynia. Because their name resembles forms used for Wallachians, some historians once imagined them as Romanians. But archaeology has shown that their settlements belonged firmly to the Western Rus world. Their culture, their princely ties, and their political activity all placed them inside that environment. They fought long and bitter struggles with the Galician princes and eventually sought support from both Hungarians and Mongols, but they were not a Romanian enclave. Their example is useful precisely because it reminds us how careful we must be with names that look similar but belong to different realities. At the same time, there really were Romanian populations north and northeast of the Carpathians, including in the Galician sphere. Medieval place names and legal traditions show that Romanian-speaking communities had spread into parts of those lands, especially in mountain and frontier zones. Their influence on language survived as well, leaving deep traces in the vocabulary of neighbouring peoples. These enclaves were real, but they should not be confused with every similarly named group in the sources. By the middle of the 13th century, after all these decades of pressure, alliance, migration and war, the political map of the Romanian lands beyond the Carpathians had changed in a major way. The old nomadic domination was weakening. In its place, local Romanian political formations were beginning to emerge more clearly. We know frustratingly little about them before the Mongol invasion, but after that catastrophe, the evidence becomes much more visible. A royal charter from the late 1240s lists several Romanian rulers and principalities in Oltenia and Western Wallachia. Around the same time, Western travellers mention a Romanian duke on his way to the Mongol court, and another traveller reports seeing envoys of the Russians and the Vlachs, among those bringing tribute to the rulers of the steppe. These references show that Romanian political entities did not suddenly appear from nowhere after the Mongol invasion. They must already have existed earlier in some form, strong enough to survive the shock of conquest and still be recognised afterward. The contacts between the populations on both sides of the Danube also continued. The Second Bulgarian Empire, born from the Great Vlach Bulgarian Uprising, remained deeply connected to the world north of the river. Cuman horsemen still appeared in the service of Bulgarian rulers, and marriage alliances tied the ruling house to steppe elites. one pretender to the Bulgarian throne found refuge among the Cumans, north of the Danube, before returning with their neutrality or support secured. That pattern is familiar by now. Again and again, the lands north of the river served as a place of regrouping, alliance, and return. While these local and regional struggles continued, a far greater danger was growing in the east. The Cumans of the lower Danube, busy with Balkan wars and local politics, failed to understand how serious the threat from the eastern steppe had become. Other Cuman groups farther east were already facing Khwarezmian and then Mongol pressure. Internal rivalries within the Cuman world also weakened resistance. Some tribes fought one another over pasture and leadership, even calling on outside powers for support against rivals. This political blindness would prove fatal. By the late 1230s, the Mongol invasion was fully underway. Batu Khan's armies smashed the Volga Bulgars, broke the main Cuman resistance, and then moved against the remaining Rus principalities. The Cumans under Kotian tried to resist, and for a moment some early clashes even went in their favour. But they could not stop the Mongol advance. One branch of the Cumans fled toward the Caucasus. Another crossed the Danube into the Balkans. A third sought refuge in Hungary. The Cumans who entered the Balkans did so in large numbers, crossing the Danube on leather floats and then plundering their way through Bulgaria, Thrace, and Macedonia. The Bulgarian ruler, John Asen II, at first allowed them to enter but then attacked them. He had good reason. However useful the Cumans had once been as military allies, a mass of steppe refugees pouring into his lands was a danger, not an opportunity. Their arrival threatened order, stability, and control. Other rulers took a different path. The Emperor of Nicaea, for example, preferred to recruit Cuman groups as mercenaries and use them in his wars against the Latins and other enemies. In this way, Cuman military power was scattered widely across the Balkans and Anatolia, no longer concentrated in the steppe world from which it had come. Another great branch of Cumans, led by Kotian, was admitted into Hungary. Their numbers were huge, perhaps tens of thousands. Yet their arrival created panic and tension, and before long their leader was murdered. The Cumans fled again, at the very moment when Hungary most needed their cavalry against the approaching Mongols. Later, they would be invited back and become a major military element inside the Hungarian kingdom for generations, often fighting beside Romanian auxiliaries in royal campaigns. Then came the full Mongol invasion of 1241 and 1242. It struck the Romanian lands, Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and Bulgaria with enormous force. Settlements were destroyed, fields ruined, and populations scattered. In the steppe, the old Cuman order was broken. Some Cumans were killed, others fled, and others were absorbed into the new Mongol dominion. The plains of the outer Carpathian world, including Bujiak and the Romanian plain, lost much of their older Turkic political structure. Yet this did not mean the total disappearance of the Cuman element. Western and Eastern travellers after the invasion still encountered Cumans in the steppe north of the Black Sea and in Crimea. Archaeology confirms their continued presence. In many places, older Turkic burial customs continued under Mongol rule. Over time, the relationship between Mongols and Cumans took on a familiar historical form. The conquerors imposed political mastery, but the conquered left deep marks on them. In the Golden Horde, the Mongol rulers gradually adopted the language of the Cumans. Official documents began to appear in that language, and later sources continued to use the name of the Cuman steppe long after the old political order had fallen. This was not unusual in world history. Again and again, small conquering elites had been absorbed linguistically and culturally by the larger populations they ruled. The same thing happened here. For the Romanians, this mattered greatly. It meant that even after the Mongol conquest, contacts with Turkic steppe groups did not end at once. They continued, but under new conditions. The older pattern of Pecheneg, Uz, and Cuman domination had been broken. In its place came Mongol supremacy. Yet the Romanian lands east of the Carpathians still lay at the meeting point of steppe and settled world, and they still had to navigate relations with the powers ruling beyond the Danube and the Black Sea. Seen as a whole, the period from the 10th to the 13th century was one of the last great ages of migration in Eastern Europe. For centuries, Romanian communities east of the Carpathians lived beside, under, and against successive waves of nomadic peoples. Those encounters slowed their development, exposed them to violence, and at times threatened their very existence. But they did not erase them. The Pechenegs, the Uzes, and the Cumans all came with tremendous force, and none of them was weaker in impact than the Avars or Bulgars who had come before. Yet by the 13th century, the political setting had changed. Around the Romanian lands now stood not only Byzantium, but also Bulgaria, Rus, and Hungary, all capable of decisive action. Their rise altered the balance of the region. So did the decline of Byzantium after the Crusader conquest of Constantinople, the rise of the Second Bulgarian Empire, and the growing ambitions of Hungary beyond the mountains. Then the Mongols shattered that balance. Their invasion ended the old migration age in Eastern Europe. It halted Hungarian expansion across the Carpathians, for a time swept away the political dominance of the Turkic Nomads, and imposed an entirely new order on the steppe. But the Romanian communities survived even this. In the ruins left behind by invasion, with the older nomadic powers broken and the older imperial structures weakened, the conditions finally appeared for local Romanian political formations to become more visible and more durable. That is the deeper meaning of this whole long era. For centuries, the Romanian lands east of the Carpathians were shaped by the violence and motion of the steppe. Yet out of that long pressure, they endured, adapted, and moved towards state formation of their own.